Hello everyone, this is Thomas here with Groove 3, and welcome to our course KONTAKT 6 Explain. In this series of videos, we're going to be diving deep into the features of KONTAKT 6, providing you with a detailed overview of every aspect of the software, from first setting up the sampler and loading patches, to advanced discussions on the more complex features of the sampler like patch design, scripting, and internal effects routing. This course will be broken down into several different chapters, so feel free to use the course as a video manual if you have questions about a specific part of the software. So feel free to skip around if you'd like. So at its core, KONTAKT 6 is a really advanced audio sampler instrument. Most people just use it for its basic features, like loading patches into the main section and playing those back, like string libraries or keyboard sounds, but there's actually lots of in-depth and really interesting features that the sampler has, like internal effects routing, modulation, and advanced sample editing. So in this first video, we're going to take a quick look at setting up KONTAKT in standalone mode and loading in patches. So once you install KONTAKT 6, you have two options for running the software. You can either run it as a VST instrument inside of a digital audio workstation, which we're going to be doing a bit later, or you can run it in standalone mode on your computer, which is what we have here. When running this instrument in standalone mode, you have several different options that you can configure for your audio and MIDI settings. To configure these options so that we can get our keyboard to be playing the KONTAKT instrument, and then we can also hear the audio, let's go ahead and go up to the Settings tab. You can select that from this dropdown. Or if you're in standalone mode, you can go to this dropdown and select Preferences. From here, you'll be given the different options that you have to set up your software. Now, there's quite a bit of different advanced options that we have, but the ones we'll be worrying about today is getting our basic audio and MIDI settings set up. So first, let's go over to our audio settings. And the first setting is going to be the driver. The driver that I have installed on my Mac is going to be a core audio driver. If you're on Windows, you may need to install additional audio drivers from the Native Instruments website, or alternatively, you may also have to install different drivers from your audio interface manufacturer. So also check their website as well. Next, we have the device. This is where we set our audio interface so that we can get sound out through our sound card or through our computer. So right now it's set to built-in, which means that the audio output is going to be routed through my computer. If I wanted to set it to my audio interface that I have plugged in right now, I could set it to the Scarlett 2i2 USB audio interface, and make sure again to install any drivers from the manufacturer's website as well. For now, I'm actually going to set it to the Soundflower 2 channel, which is just an internal audio routing inside my computer so that you can hear the audio for this tutorial. So don't worry about that specifically, that's just for the sake of this video. Next, we can configure our sample rate. So we have all these different options, which are based upon our audio interface. So for now, we'll just leave it at the default 44.1. And then we can leave our latency at 512 samples. Once we start loading up more patches and get more advanced and more complicated sounds, we can bump this up so that we can play back more audio without getting any glitches. But this will also increase the amount of time it takes between when we hit a key on our keyboard and when it plays a sound. So there'll be kind of a short delay. But for now, we can just leave this at its default state, and then we can just go over to our MIDI settings and set up our MIDI controller. So from here, you'll see all of your plugged in MIDI devices. And again, make sure to have the drivers installed for your MIDI instruments. So right now, the keyboard that I have plugged into my computer is an M-Audio Oxygen 61 keyboard. You'll see that the status is set to port A. Go ahead and click on that, and it may be by default set to off. And you want to set a different MIDI port for this channel. Because I want this keyboard to be my main keyboard, we're going to go ahead and put this to port A. So that means it'll send MIDI data from my keyboard into KONTAKT. You can configure multiple keyboards here as well, so that's what these different ports are for. So if you wanted to have several different keyboards all playing back different parts of the software, you can do that from here as well. So for now, we can just hit close. And then let's go ahead and load up a basic patch. So we can go over to our libraries. I've already got some libraries opened up here, and we'll just go ahead and drag in a patch and drop it down into the rack. Now that we have everything set up properly, whenever I press a key on my keyboard, you're going to see that there's going to be MIDI data that's being triggered. And there's also audio being played back. This main browser has tons of different advanced features, which we'll be covering in its own video a little bit later in the course. But for now, that just shows you how to load up a basic instrument into KONTAKT. So that's all for this video. Now you have everything in KONTAKT set up so you can hear audio and you can play MIDI in your instruments. Join me in the next video where we'll be breaking down the interface of KONTAKT and showing you all of the different parts of the software. Thanks, and I'll see you there. In this video, we're going to be giving a basic overview of KONTAKT's interface and showing how all of it works. So inside of Ableton Live, I have a copy of KONTAKT, which I just dragged and dropped onto a new MIDI channel here in Ableton, and then we can open up that instrument device to see our new instance of KONTAKT. And then from the browser, I just dragged in one of Kontakt's instrument devices. So what we'll do first is cover some of the configurable settings that we have on Kontakt's interface. Those can be configured from this drop-down menu along the top. We can turn off and on our browser by either deselecting it or enabling it. We can turn off and on the master section, which gives us some advanced controls that we'll cover here in a minute. We could turn on and off the info section along the bottom, which whenever we hover over different sections of our software, it'll tell us a little bit more information about it. And you'll see that along this bottom right here whenever this is enabled. And then we also have the options to configure our outputs. So this pop-up menu, so we have some auxiliary channels and our master output channel, which we'll cover at length in a future video. I could just deselect that for now. You can also enable a keyboard along the bottom, which will show where our instrument device is loaded up onto our keyboard. We can also play back our instrument from here as well. And then we also have the option to enable this quick load menu, which right now I don't have anything loaded up into my quick load menu. But if you did want to do so, we could just move over to Kontakt's libraries. Then we could just drag in the instrument that we wanted to load. And then now whenever we enable this, we could just quickly load it in from this menu. So we just drag and drop. So the way that Kontakt is organized is organized into an instrument device rack. From here, we can drag and drop various different instruments into this whole section. We can load up to 16 in this first panel, so we can go down vertically. Then we can load up to 16 in this channel, and then we can go all the way up to 64 different instruments. You can also layer these devices with different effects as well, which really unlocks a lot of advanced sound design options, which we'll talk about in depth in future videos. The setup of having an instrument rack inside of Kontakt is really helpful because it enables you to layer multiple libraries on top of one another to create new patches, like larger symphonic patches. So you could layer up a cello, a violin, or multiple instruments within the orchestra, or you can layer synthesizers and keyboards on top of one another to create new and interesting types of synth sounds. On the left, we have our main browser section, which has quite a few different sections, which we'll cover at length in a future video. We have this information panel along the bottom, which you can configure from this drop-down menu. We have this master tune section along the top, which enables us to control the entire volume of our entire instrument. So if we wanted to turn everything down completely, we could control that from this menu, or if we wanted to turn everything up in our entire instance of Kontakt, we could do that from this section as well. Also, and if you hold Command and click on the parameter, or hold Option and click on a PC, it's going to reset that parameter to its default state. We also have the option to adjust the master tuning of our entire instance of Kontakt. So if we wanted to detune everything slightly, we could do that from here. And we also have some options to create an internal metronome as well. Now looking down at this instrument that we have loaded in, there are several different options along this top menu. So as you may have noticed, there's advanced options we have right here to configure this specific device, which I can click on this Kontakt icon and it'll minimize that. And then you'll just see the main instrument parameters that we can control. And these remain consistent across all the devices inside of Kontakt. So from here, we can control the actual patch. So we can scroll for new or different patches. We can configure the internal effects routing of our instrument inside of Kontakt. We could select a MIDI channel. Right now it's set to port A, which is from Ableton Live, so it's playing back whenever I press key on my keyboard. We could set the max amount of voices that we have. It'll tell us how much memory this specific patch is using. And we can also solo or mute this instrument device from here as well. We also have the option to control the individual pan settings of this instrument. So if we wanted to pan that to the left, we could do so here. Or we could pan that to the right. I just have a drum set loaded up here right now from the factory sounds. And we can also command click on a Mac or option click on a PC to reset that to 0. We can control the overall pitch of the entire instrument. And that's just controlling this specific instrument. If you want to control all the different pitches of the instruments, you can control that via the master tune setting. You also have the option to control the volume of this specific instrument from here as well. If you want to minimize this because you have lots of different instruments loaded into your rack, you can do so by clicking on this minimize button. You can control the auxiliary sends that we have on this instrument. You can see the performance view, which is this larger view that gives us a bit more control over this specific instrument. And this will change based on what instrument you have loaded in. Or if you wanted to remove this device from your effects rack, you could just click this X button and it'll remove that device. So that's all for this video, giving you a basic overview of Kontakt's interface and layout. Join me in the next video where we'll talk in depth about this main browser section and how it all works. Thanks, and I'll see you there. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the browser section inside of Kontakt 6. The browser is used both to load existing patches and sample libraries, and is also used to load audio samples so you can create your own patches inside of Kontakt. If you don't see the sample browser, make sure to go up to this top menu and make sure that browser is enabled from this menu. So if your interface looks something like this, just go to the top menu and enable the browser so you can view it. So the browser can be broken down into 4 different parts. The first part's the library section that stores all of your different Kontakt libraries. The second section is the files section that you can use to view files on your computer. So for example, if you want to grab an audio file off your desktop. The expert section, which is used to edit your Kontakt patches that you have loaded up into Kontakt's rack. And the automation section, which is used to configure automation. So let's go ahead and start with the libraries panel. So along the top of the libraries panel, we have several different options. The first is the refresh libraries button, which you can find along the top. This is just used to refresh your library's view. So say for example, you had a new Kontakt library that you had loaded in, but it wasn't showing up in this menu. You could press the refresh libraries button, and then it would show up. Then you have the manage libraries button. Whenever you click this, it'll give you the option to manage your different Kontakt libraries and load them into the sampler. From this menu, you can click on one of these icons to hide a Kontakt library or enable it. So if you just loaded something for the first time, it might not be enabled. So you'll want to go in and show that Kontakt library. And the nice part about this is all your Kontakt libraries are now handled through native access. So even if you had something installed in a separate install location on your computer, like I have for this new West African sample library, which I installed on my desktop, because everything's handled through the native instruments authorizer, it knows exactly where everything's loaded on your computer. So it'll automatically scan for all your new Kontakt libraries and load them into the sampler. The next button that we have on Kontakt is this A through Z button. What this does is it'll organize your Kontakt libraries alphabetically. So whenever you press this button, it'll organize everything by the first letter in the Kontakt library name, which by default, all these libraries are laid out alphabetically anyway, so you don't see a change. But whenever you disable this, it'll go back to whatever order you had previously. You can customize the order of your Kontakt libraries by clicking on one of the libraries and dragging it, and that'll reorganize everything. So now whenever I press this A through Z button, you'll see that it changes the order of those libraries so that they're organized alphabetically. The next thing that you have is the search bar. This lets you search for a company or library name inside your search window. So say for example, I was looking for the factory libraries, which are just right here, but let's say for example, we had lots of different libraries loaded in. You could just type in factory. Then the libraries that don't match that search parameter will be hidden, and then you could see the ones that do actually match that search parameter. The last thing you have in this section is the instrument navigation button. This will either show or hide the instrument navigation panel that you can find along the bottom of the browser. This is just used to move around and select the various different instruments that you have loaded into your Kontakt rack. So let's go ahead and just grab a few patches so I can show you how this works. We'll just go into the horn section here and just grab into these different saxophone patches. And as these patches are loading up, you can see down here in the instrument navigation window, I can go and I can select these patches, I can mute those individual patches, or I can solo them from here as well. So this is just a handy tool that makes organization inside Kontakt when you're working with multiple instruments loaded into the rack a little bit quicker. So for now, we can just go and remove these by pressing the X in the upper right-hand corner. Now that we have this top library out of the way, I could show you how to navigate through the different Kontakt factory libraries. So the way that this works is really similar to the way that files will be organized on both a Mac and a PC. You have these main folders that have instruments inside of them, which you can select from just clicking on this menu. And you'll get this drop down. You can go double click this section, then it goes into the band folder, and then we can select a subfolder, for example, like electric pianos, and then we could select all of our different electric piano patches. We can then click on one of these patches and drag it into Kontakt's rack, and it will load up that specific patch. You can also load patches and Kontakt libraries by double-clicking them in the browser. The other main section of the browser is the Files tab. This can be used to either search for patches or Kontakt libraries that you have loaded onto your computer, and it can also be used to load audio files from your computer as well, which is what we'll be using it for. This operates just like the file menus on your computer would, so you can navigate around your hard drive of your computer and find patches, or more importantly, find audio samples that you can then drag and drop into your devices. So let's say, for example, I wanted to go onto my hard drive on my Mac, and if you're on a PC, this will look slightly different, but it'll still have this file tree. I could go into my users, go into where I have my factory library saved. I could navigate over here, find some samples or patches, and double click on those Kontakt patches. And then we'll see that inside of these, we've got some horn samples, and then we can actually go a step farther, and then we can have these audio samples. So these are the individual audio files. We could just click and drag one of those to load it in. And then now we have this audio file loaded into Kontakt. So this main file tree works in conjunction with this other browser at the bottom. So this top menu is how you navigate around all the different folders. And then on this menu, you can grab all the individual audio samples or files. The next tab that we have is the expert panel. And this menu is just used to navigate around the various sections of your instrument. And we'll be covering this in conjunction with some other things in some later videos. So don't worry about this for now, as it relates to editing your actual instruments. The other section that we have in the browser is the automation tab. And this is just used to manage the various different automatable parameters for all your Kontakt devices. Automation will have its own dedicated video, so we'll be covering this menu in depth and also automating in your digital audio workstation sequencer. So we'll cover this in depth in a future video. But for now, you can just know that this deals with automation. And the main two windows that we'll be using the most are the Files menu and the Libraries tab. The final thing that I want to talk about is saving patches. So let's say, for example, we have this keyboard patch loaded in, we made some edits to it that we really like, and we want to save that as a new instrument. We can go up to the Save icon, select from the drop-down, and go either Save As, and we could save it as its current instrument name, or we can hit Save Multi-As to save our patch, so we can give it a name, and then we have some configurable file settings down here as well, so we can save the audio files with the actual patch. The interface from your computer may look slightly different if you're on a PC, but it'll still have all those same options. So that's all for this video. I hope you found this video useful, and I'll see you in the next one. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at loading audio samples into Kontakt 6. And then in the next video, we'll take an in-depth look at mapping those same samples across our sampler's keyboard. For this video, we're going to be working with samples from the Kontakt factory library so everyone can follow along if they'd like. So for my Kontakt factory library that you can see in this window, I have that installed as default location. But if you're not sure where your Kontakt factory library is installed, or if you're on a PC and install locations are slightly different, what you can do is go down to Native Access, which is Native Instruments Installer and Authorization Application. Then you can go to Kontakt Factory Library underneath Installed Products. You can just click on that, go to Installation Path, and then it'll tell you the content location for your currently installed Kontakt Factory Library. So you'll see that mine is stored under Users, Shared, and then Kontakt Factory Library. So if you're on a PC, or if you install this in a different location on your computer, this install location may look slightly different. But if you want to follow along, just make sure to follow whatever path this is in the sample browser in Kontakt, and you'll navigate over to the samples. So for now, we can just close that out, and I can show you how to load those samples in. Let's go over to our File menu, and then we'll just follow that file tree that I showed you a moment ago. So we'll go to the Macintosh hard drive, we'll go down to Users, we'll do Shared, and go down to Kontakt Factories Library. Then we'll go to Samples, and then we're going to grab the first band 01, open that up, and we have several different options here. We're going to go into the horn samples, and then we're going to select the alto saxophone samples. You'll see that all the audio files are available in this submenu. Now, sometimes these files inside the sampler have information stored on them that tell you what pitch that specific sample was recorded at. So for example, you'll see that this says that this is a sharp. If we scroll down, you'll see that we have a C sharp, and we have an E as well. That's this E2 section. Then we have different characterizations and different velocities of each of those different samples. So this will be helpful later whenever we start mapping those samples across our sampler's keyboard. That way we can make sure that everything is properly in pitch. So whenever you're working with audio samples inside of Kontakt, you have several different options to load everything in. The first way is you can just click on a sample and drag and drop it into Kontakt's rack. And then if we look at the sample, if we open it up and go to the mapping editor, which we'll cover in depth in the next video, you'll see that the sample is now loaded in. So we have the sample name, we have our sampler's keyboard, and the sample is mapped across that entire keyboard. The nice part about this is we can also load multiple audio samples in at the same time as well. So you can either drag and drop single samples in, we can drag and drop that one in, drag and drop another one in, and just keep layering those samples on top of our sampler. Or we can select multiple samples at the same time from our file menu and drag and drop everything in at once. So the way that this works is you can either hold the Command key on a Mac computer or the Control key on a PC, to select multiple samples at the same time. So for the sake of example, let's go ahead and choose this A sharp 2 number 1, and then we'll scroll down to the C sharp number 1 while holding Command on my Mac. That selects the next sample, and then we can grab one of these samples that's in an E as well. And then we can just drag and drop that into the rack, and then you'll see that it has our A sharp sample plus 2 others. So now whenever we open things up and view the mapping editor, you'll see that we have each of those individual samples now loaded into Kontakt Sampler. Also, if you want to select multiple samples that are all in the same row, you could select the first sample and then hold Shift and select the last sample that you want, and then Kontakt will select all the samples in between those as well. Alternatively, you can also go over to the File menu and create a new blank instrument. So we can select this menu and select New Instrument. And then we have a blank new instance of Kontakt Sampler we can go and drop files into if we want. So if you prefer to drag and drop your samples into an already existing instance of Kontakt Sampler, you can do that this way as well. If you're in the standalone version of Kontakt, you can also use your sample browser to drag and drop samples into Kontakt as well. But in the case of Ableton Live, because I don't have anything pinned open right now, whenever I go down to Finder and try to drag something in, it closes out. But that just depends on the preferences of your digital audio workstation. But usually whenever I'm working with Kontakt, I like to just use the internal sample browser to grab all of my samples and just drop them in. I find this a little bit easier. So that's all for this short video on loading samples into Kontakt. Join me in the next video where we'll dive deep into the various different mapping options that we have for the samples in this device, and I'll show you how to map everything so it plays back on the proper pitches on your keyboard, and also some more advanced features of the mapping editor. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next video. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at Kontakt's mapping editor. This section of the device is used to make sure that everything plays back at the proper pitches, and we'll also be covering some of the more advanced features of the mapping editor as well. So what we'll do is we'll first create a new blank instrument, and I'll show you how to drag and drop everything into the mapping editor. Go over to this save icon, select create new instrument, and then we'll go ahead and open this up and go over to the mapping editor. Now let's go ahead and grab a few different samples that we'll use today. So go over to the files menu, and I went ahead and already navigated down to the alto saxophone samples that we used in the previous video, which is just under Macintosh HD, users, shared, Kontakt Factory library. That's under this first band folder, and then it's under the horn samples. And if you have any more questions about how to navigate to this, you can always refer back to the previous video to see how I got to these samples. So while we're scrolling through these different saxophone samples, what we can also do is we can audition them to decide which one we want to pick out. So I can click on the sample and go down to my audition menu at the very bottom here. And this is a volume control to control how loud everything plays back. We can play the sample. We can also stop the sample by clicking the play icon again, or we can turn on auto mode, which will play the sample whenever I click in the browser. So it just depends on how you want to search for things. For now, I can go ahead and turn off auto, and then we're going to go ahead and move down to one of these C sharp 1 or C sharp 2 samples. And we'll just drag and drop that into the mapping editor. Now, as you may have noticed there, depending on how I drop this into the mapping editor, it'll change how it's mapped across the keys. So the way that this works is the width of this yellow box controls how many keys this is mapped to. The up and down range controls the amount of velocity sensitivity that this specific sample has. So what I can do for now is actually delete the sample and then show you a few different ways that we can load in these audio samples. So if I click and drag that onto the mapping editor, and I move my cursor down farther, you can see that it's only mapping to one of these notes. That's what that single column means. But as I increase the distance, this is from the keyboard, you'll see that it's starting to map to more and more of those keys. And if I put it all the way at the top, it's going to map it to every single key and every single velocity available. So now our sample is loaded into the device. And as you may have noticed there as well, there's a red icon that appears on this main section whenever I play back a key. So that shows at what velocity it's being played at and also what note. So that's playing at the C1 octave. And then as you may have noticed, this is actually not playing in key. So whenever I'm pressing a C note on my keyboard, it's actually playing the root note, which in our case is C sharp. So what we can do to adjust that is either go up into this menu and adjust it underneath the root key setting, or we can click on this key here, which is the root key, this yellow key. And we can click that and drag it onto a new key. So what I did is I went ahead and clicked and dragged that onto the C sharp. So now whenever I play everything back, everything plays back at the proper pitches. We can also adjust the sample playback range by grabbing the ends of this yellow box and moving them. So right now, if I play a note that's down here in this section, so let me scroll down a little bit on my keyboard, you won't have any audio that's being played back. So even though I'm playing these notes, you can see from this red indicator here, there's nothing being triggered because it's not in the sample playback range. You can also scroll over to the side here as well and drag that. So that changes the highest note that we can play back on our keyboard. You can also use this to control the velocity as well. So if I bring this down almost all the way and I play really softly on my keyboard, we'll hear audio being played back. But if I play really hard on one of my keys, you can see that the indicator up at the top is flashing, but no audio is being played back because we've adjusted the trigger range of our sample. This is really great whenever you're creating multi-sampled patches, like a snare drum, for example. You could have a really soft snare drum sound at the bottom, and then you could drag this up, and you could load in another sample and put it in this section, and you could load in another sample and put it right above, and then that way you could create a multi-sampled snare that plays back a slightly different sound whenever you hit that snare drum sample at different velocities. And as I just showed there as well, you can click and drag on that sample to change its location. And just keep in mind, as you can see from this yellow key at the bottom, it's also changing our root note. So you'd want to go in and make any adjustments necessary to change that back so that everything plays in key. So now we can move on to this bar along the top and discuss these features. So this first one is just the key range. This just controls the range at which you play all your different keys in the keyboard. So that's the same as adjusting this edge on this yellow box. It's just another way to manually enter that in. We also have the options to go in and adjust the velocity range too, just like we would by clicking and dragging this box. So it's whichever way you'd like to adjust that. We can enter in a root key here, so we could change that from this menu just by clicking on it and entering it in on our keyboard. You can adjust the sample's volume. So right now it's set to 0 decibels, but you could turn it down or turn it up in volume. You can also set individual pan controls for that sample. So we could pan that sample all the way to the left so that we can only hear it in the left channel, or vice versa, we could put it on the right channel. We also have the option to individually adjust the tuning of the sample. So if we're working with an acoustic instrument that's been multi-sampled, we could adjust the individual tuning of that sample to make sure that everything fits perfectly in key with our project. So now let's talk a little bit more about the different ways we can split velocity inside the mapping editor in Kontakt. So now whenever I play back that sample at any velocity, it's always going to be triggering that exact same sample. But what we can do is we can place multiple samples on the mapping editor to create more variation whenever I'm playing different samples at different velocities. So to show you how this works, let's go ahead and turn down that velocity range for a saxophone sample. And then let's go back to the factory library here, and let's grab something that's really different, like a drum sample. We'll go ahead and navigate into this African Night sample pack, and we'll drag in this sample, which just sounds like this. So it's just a simple drum loop. We'll go ahead and drag and drop that onto Kontakt's editor. Then we're going to adjust the sample playback range so that the velocity starts right after the saxophone sample ends. We can also adjust the range here so it plays back on all the same keys. And now listen to what happens whenever I press my key softly. We can hear the saxophone sample being played back, but whenever I press my key really hard, it's playing back that drum sample. So this just shows you how you can split zones via velocity to create variation inside your patterns. And obviously this is a pretty extreme example. Usually you'd use the same instrument device like a snare drum, and you'd have a softer snare velocity on the bottom and a louder snare sample on the top. But I just use this so it shows you exactly what's happening here, so it's easy to hear the difference. So for now I could just remove the drum sample so that we just have our saxophone. And then we can cover this area along the top. So the first control in here is the list view. What this does is it lets us see all of our samples in an easy-to-view list, which can be convenient for working with larger patches. So say, for example, you're working with a complicated multi-sampled piano patch that has hundreds of different samples in it. You can easily view things and also view the groups that everything is in from this menu. And don't worry about this group for now. Everything currently is in the same group, group number 1. We'll talk about that a bit later. So the next section is this editing menu. And this gives us different tools to edit our samples. So we have some basic cut, copy, paste, and delete settings. We can exchange the samples. So if we wanted to swap out our sample for another sample on our hard drive, we can click on this button and it'll show us our different sample libraries that we can navigate around our computer to find a different sample that we'd like to swap that out with. Then we have some different zone selection tools, which could be helpful for editing. We have some group options, which can take samples that you've either selected. You can add them to existing groups or create new groups with them. You have some batch editing tools that you can use to apply crossfades between samples or move around root keys. You have this AET morphing layer, which we're not going to cover for now, as this is an advanced feature that has to do with the effects devices, so we'll talk about this later. And then we also just have some other configurable preferences for our editing. The next control that we have is select zones via MIDI. And whenever this is enabled, it'll select the sample that's being played whenever you hit that key. This could be a great way to address problem areas in a patch if you need to edit a specific sample, especially if you have lots of different samples in a single instance of Kontakt. This next control is the Auto Spread Zone Key Ranges tool, which is used to fill in gaps in your key range. So whenever I hit this, it's now going to fill up every key on the sampler automatically. And I'll show you how this is used practically in an example a bit later. The control underneath this is the Auto Spread Velocity Ranges, which is the same thing, but it'll automatically fill all the velocity ranges here. So let's say I was editing the sample, and I wanted to automatically fill up this whole range. I could just hit this button, and it fills that entire velocity range. These next two controls, the Auto Map Selected and the Auto Spread Key Ranges via root key functions, are used to automatically map all your samples to the keys on the keyboard based on the preferences that you have set in this menu down at the bottom. And I'll show you that in an example a little bit later in this video. This next control, Resolve Overlapping Key Ranges, will fix any overlapping key ranges that you have in your samples. So let's go ahead and grab that loop again that we were working with a bit earlier and drag it in. So let's say there's some overlap here and we don't want that. What we can do is we can select these samples and then we can hit this button and it'll automatically fix that issue. So now this sample doesn't overlap with our drum loop. This other button, the Resolve Auto Mapping Velocity Ranges, operates the same way, except that it works with velocity ranges. So let's say that we had something similar to this, and then we could hit this button whenever we have both samples selected, and it will adjust for those velocities. So now there's no overlapping velocities. So whenever I hit this sample, it triggers at one level of velocity, and then whenever I hit another higher level velocity, it'll trigger this other sample. This is convenient for quickly editing different multi-sampled patches. These other two controls let you set your velocity and key ranges via MIDI. So whenever this one is selected, the Select Key Range via MIDI, and I have the sample selected, I can hit a low key on my keyboard, on my sampler, and then whenever I hit a higher point on my keyboard, you'll see that it's snapped automatically to that note that I hit, which in my case is this G right here. That works the same for the Set Velocity Range via MIDI control as well. So I could set my high and low points for the sample, so we can hit that key at a moderate velocity. Then we could also hit a really soft velocity as well. And now you can see that it's at the highest point at the highest velocity that I played, and it's set the lowest point at the lowest velocity that I played. So this is another way of manually entering in your different velocity and key ranges. This next button is the Lock Zones button, which will just lock the individual samples so you don't accidentally edit something you don't want to. And then we have this Solo Zone button, which follows the selected zone and only plays that sample that you have selected, which could be great for editing various different samples, especially when working with more complicated patches. Then we have the Selected Groups Only button, which will only show the selected groups that you have selected in the group editor. This other button is the Auto Select Group button, which will automatically select the different groups that you play on your keyboard. The final control that we have along this top menu is the Sample window. And here you can see the sample that you're currently using, and you could use these arrows to the left and to the right to automatically switch out that sample if there's more samples that are loaded in that same folder. So this can be a great way to audition multiple samples quickly for one of your sample slots on the sampler. We also have an option where we can crossfade between two different samples. Let's say that we had these two samples and we wanted them to overlap slightly. And actually we can just adjust these velocity ranges as well. Whenever I play this note on my keyboard, you just hear the saxophone sample. And whenever I play this note on my keyboard, you're just going to hear the drum sample. Whenever I play this G note on my keyboard, you're going to hear both samples at the same time. Which sounds a bit chaotic for now, but that just shows you that you can crossfade between two different samples. And that's all for the first part of this video. Join me in the next part where I'll be talking a bit more about automatically mapping samples in Kontakt 6. So now let's talk a little bit more about the automatic sample mapping features that you have inside of Kontakt. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and remove the samples that we have loaded in so far. And then we can go back over to Kontakt's factory library, go over to this band folder, and grab some alto saxophone samples. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and drag in a few of these samples, and I'm going to intentionally put them at the wrong places on this keyboard window. So let's put C3 somewhere all the way at this top here. So we'll put the C3 note all the way up there, C sharp 3. We can take this E, it's an E5, so it's a really high note. We'll put that really low down on the keyboard. And then let's take this A sharp number 2, and we'll put that in the center. So now if I was to go in and to play back all these different samples, everything would be totally out of key, and they wouldn't even be playing back in a chromatic scale. But what we can do is we can use the automatic mapping editor to change this, to automatically go in and map each of these samples across our keyboard. So what we can do is hit this drop-down menu with one of our samples selected and go down to Auto Map Setup. Then you're going to get this pop-up window. So what this is doing is it's scanning the actual file name that we have on our sample. So you can tell it to either pay attention to or ignore various different parts of your sample. So right now we have it set to ignore all these different parts except for the note value that we have. And we're going to make sure that that's set to make root key. Then we can hit apply and close. And then I can go in and select all these different samples and then hit the auto map button. And now whenever I click on these individual samples, so you'll see that this is now an E note, and its root key is also set to E. And whenever I select this one, you'll see that the root key is A sharp, and that corresponds to the file name. And you'll see that this one is a C sharp in the third octave, and that's also corresponding to the file name. So Kontakt has automatically scanned all those samples. We told it what we wanted to pay attention to in the sample name and what we wanted it to ignore, and it automatically went in and mapped everything, which makes everything super simple and really quick to make complicated patches. We can also take this a step further and reorganize our samples as well. So I'll just go ahead and select everything, and then we're going to hit the spread ranges function. So it spreads out all of our different samples. And then we're going to hit the auto spread key ranges via root key function. And now if we go back and look at our keyboard, we'll see that it's actually went in and adjusted each of these individual samples. So now our higher up samples are higher up on our keyboard, and our lower samples that are in the second octave here are playing back lower on our keyboard. So Kontakt has automatically went in and switched around the order of each of our samples on our keyboard. So now whenever I go in and I play things on my keyboard, everything plays back at its proper pitches, everything's ordered correctly, and now we've created a multi-sampled patch. The cool part about this as well is you can even go into this editor and set up things like velocity. So if this was the velocity of that specific note, you could tell it to make the minimum velocity or make the maximum velocity for that specific note. And then whenever you go in and adjust your auto mapping, it'll set the velocity for each of those individual samples. So let's say you had a piano and you recorded 100 different velocities on that piano. You could put on the file names velocity 1, velocity 2, and so on and so forth, and then you could tell Kontakt to pay attention to that file name and to set the velocities automatically. This makes creating really complicated multi-sample patches a lot faster, where previously in other samplers, you'd have to go and set each note and each velocity range. Kontakt has these advanced features where it can go in and scan everything and do it automatically for you. So this is one of the cool features that make Kontakt really fantastic. I'm also going to show you one last thing as well with the quick mapping features inside Kontakt. And that's the different ways you can automatically map samples whenever you're dragging them in and dropping them into the mapping editor. So let's go ahead and grab 3 different samples. If I move all the way down to one note, or I move onto the actual key, you'll see that now whenever I drop that, everything's just mapped to the C note, but it's spread those samples out across different velocities. So this is a really quick way of just taking several different samples that are all recorded the same note at different velocities and dragging and dropping them into Kontakt. Or if you want to map things across the keyboard, you could drag them in and adjust them accordingly and give everything as many notes as you want it. So if we put it all the way down here, at the bottom of this interface, it'll just put each sample on each key. But if we drag and drop them a little bit higher up in the interface, you'll see that it's spreading out each of these individual samples across the keyboard. So now this first sample corresponds to a few different notes, and same with the other samples as well. So that's all for this video on the mapping editor. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next video. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the group editor inside KONTAKT 6. So to show how this works, let's go ahead and load in an orchestral percussion patch from the factory library. So just go over to KONTAKT's factory library, go over to orchestral, double click on that folder, go down to orchestral percussion, and we're going to load in this various percussion patch. So we can just double click on that, and it will load into KONTAKT. Then we can navigate over to this wrench icon, and then move over to the group editor. From here, you can see the various different groups that we have in our KONTAKT device. You can see that the samples have been organized into these groups, which you can kind of think of as sample folders. So we have an anvil sound, we have various different drum hits, triangle sounds, so all the different orchestral percussive elements. If we move over to the mapping editor, you could see all these different samples laid out across the keyboard. So over here towards the top of everything, we have this clave sound, which is then organized into its own folder. Additionally, another way to view the groups is to go over to the expert panel on KONTAKT and make sure that groups is selected, and then you can select and view all the different groups inside your patch. This could be a helpful way to view everything whenever you have lots of different sample groups if you're working on a really complicated patch. So for now, we can just close out the mapping editor so we can just see our groups. So the groups panel is split into three different areas. We have this top bar that's used to edit some of the group's functions. We have this main section that we can use to select the various different elements in our groups. And then we have this bottom bar that gives us some options to control how our groups are played back. The groups inside KONTAKT are just different ways we can organize our samples together so that we can have various different voice settings or trigger settings. So let's talk about the first section of the group editor, this top bar. The first control is this Edit All Groups button. Whenever this is enabled, it'll be red. So this is whenever it's not enabled. And you can see that it lights up and selects everything down here in the main group window. And this lets you edit each of the groups at the same time in this section. So whenever I make a change to the voice settings or one of the trigger modes, it'll make that change to every single group inside of this entire instrument. Just keep in mind that if you want to edit a single group inside KONTAKT, make sure that you deselect this option. Otherwise, you'll edit each of the groups at the same time, which may not be helpful if you're trying to make a specific change to just one of the groups. Whenever the Edit All Groups option is deselected, you also have the option to select groups by just clicking on them. You'll see that the box next to the group is filled in. That means that that group is selected. The next control that we have is this drop-down menu. This is just another way to select individual groups and can be helpful when you have lots of different groups inside your KONTAKT patch. So if we just wanted to select the log drum high, we could click on that from the drop-down menu, and you'll see that that is now the only group that is selected. The next control that we have is this edit menu. This gives us various different options for editing our different groups. So we can delete selected groups, we can purge empty groups, so if there's groups that have no samples that aren't being used, we can remove those from this menu. We can copy, cut, duplicate, or paste various different groups. And we also have the option to either export a group or import a group. We can just rename this Anvil group test. Then we can go up to this menu, we can export that group onto my desktop. So I have a patches folder set up on my desktop, and then we can name this something like test group, and make sure that absolute sample paths is selected so that it saves all the samples with everything. Hit save, and then if I wanted to import that group, we could go ahead and go over to the drop-down menu, hit import group, navigate over to the desktop where I have this loaded, and hit open. And you'll see now that down here it is loaded in our new test group. So this can be great whenever you want to combine different patches in various different ways. The next button is the Group Solo button. This will solo the selected group inside the sampler. This lets you check the contents of a group whenever you're working with multiple groups whose zones may overlap. So to demo this, I went ahead and created a simple patch that combines a drum loop with a horn sample like we had before in a previous video. So let's go ahead and delete this KONTAKT patch. And then I'm going to go over to my Files menu, and we're going to go over to the desktop. I'm going to go over to Native Instruments Patches where I have this loaded up. And it's going to be this group editor demo patch. So I'll just drag and drop that in and then open it up. And you can see that we have this loop, which is just a drum loop, and we also have a horn sample, and they're overlapping on top of one another. So whenever I press a key in my keyboard right now, you're going to hear both the horn sample and the drum loop being played back. So it's a little bit chaotic sounding, but this is just for the sake of the demo. So if I have this group solo enabled, and I have just my horn group selected, now whenever I press my key, you'll hear just that horn group. Whenever I press just the drum group, and if we turn off Enable All Groups here, you'll just see the drum group being played back. But whenever I deselect this group solo, you'll hear both samples being played back at the same time. And that's because they overlap down here in the mapping editor. So this can be great whenever you're editing more complicated patches and can make the editing process a little bit easier, because you can solo the patch that you're just wanting to work on. The next control is select via MIDI. This is similar to the select samples via MIDI in the mapping window that we covered previously, where it will select a group whenever you trigger it on your keyboard. So let's go ahead and enable that real quick. And now whenever I press one of my keys on my keyboard, and let's actually just go a little bit lower down here. So let's say I selected this note. You'll see that it's just selected the drum group. Whenever I play a higher up note on my keyboard, where both these samples are overlapping, you'll see that it's now selected the horn group, which is this main section. Just one thing you'll want to be aware of with the group select via MIDI control is that whenever groups overlap, like they currently do with these top two groups, Kontakt will trigger both the groups, but will only select the group that's the first in the group editor menu. So it will trigger both these groups, but will only select the first group on the left. The final control along this top menu is just this create empty group control. And that does just that. It creates a new group, which you can double click and rename. So we could rename this new, and then we could assign samples to this group if we wanted to. And also, if you'd like to assign a sample to the groups inside the mapping editor, the process is pretty easy. You could just click on the sample and then right click and then go to move to existing group. And then let's say we wanted to take this horn sample and move it to the new group. We just select that from the drop-down menu, and the sample will now be applied to that new group. So that's all for the first part of this video. Join me in the next part where we'll be finishing out our discussion on the group editor. Now with these two main sections out of the way, let's go ahead and move on to the menu options that we have along the bottom of our device. And that's just voice group setting. These are just groups that are separate from your main groups that let you control how the groups are going to be played back. This lets you control how many voices you can play at the same time for each of the different groups. So to show you how this works, let's go ahead and load in a basic drum patch, and I'll show you a practical example of how you'd use these voice groups. So let's just go ahead and delete that patch. We don't want to save any of the changes, so we can just hit no. And then let's load in this basic drum set. And we can open that up. And if we look down here at the keys, you'll see that we have several different samples loaded up. On C1, I have a kick drum. On D1, I have a snare drum. I have a closed hi-hat on this note. Then I have an open hi-hat on this note. So let's say, for example, you're working on this patch, and you wanted to have both an open and a closed hi-hat sample. But in order for this to sound realistic, you need to stop the playback of the open hi-hat whenever you play the closed hi-hat, because right now you can play both those samples at the same time. But if you were to put your entire sample's polyphony down to 1, so that this effect is achieved so you can only play one note at a time, then you wouldn't be able to play back your kick and snare as well on top of the hi-hat pattern, which wouldn't give you a very realistic sounding drum pattern. But what you can do with the voice groups is set how individual groups are triggered within the larger Kontakt patch. You can limit the amount of voices that are going to be played back for just a single group within the Kontakt patch. So I can make some changes to just the hi-hats and leave my kick and snare intact. So to do this, you'll first want to make sure that Edit All Groups is disabled. Let's go ahead and check and make sure that we don't have any voice groups assigned to number 1 here. Okay, so let's make sure that that's set to no group. Second one is also set to no group. And then for the hi-hats, we're going to change this to voice group number 1. So what we did there is we just set the hi-hats to voice group number 1 and limited the voices to an amount of 1. So now whenever I trigger my hi-hat samples, I have my first hi-hat sample and my longer hi-hat sample. Whenever I play those back in sequence, it'll cut off the longer hi-hat sample. So let's play the open hi-hat, and then I'll play the first hi-hat. So you see that it gives us a much more realistic sound to our hi-hat pattern, whereas before we had the option to play both notes at the same time. Down here we also have various different controls to control how those voices are going to be played back. So we have these different kill modes, which are just different ways of stopping the audio's playback. So this first one is it's going to kill any of the samples, so it'll stop the playback of any of the samples whenever you trigger another sample. The second option is to kill the oldest, which will stop the playback of the oldest playing sample. So let's say you played 3 samples in sequence. The first sample that you played back, it would cut off that sample before it cut off any of the other samples. The other option is just that, but it's inverted. So it'll stop playing back the sample that you just played. This next one is going to stop the playback of the highest pitch sample. And the final option on this menu is just going to stop the playback of the lowest pitch sample. So these are all different options that you can use to control how your voices are going to be stopped. This next control, this yes or no box, gives higher priority to re-triggering the voices that have already been played. What this means is that if you previously played a sample, like let's say you previously played the open hi-hat sample, if you have this set to yes, it's more likely to replay that open hi-hat sample than it is any other sample. So it's a different way of giving priority to re-triggering those samples. This next control is the fade time, which instead of cutting off the sample completely, it adds a short fade out to the end of your sample, which can give you a much more natural sound. So let's go ahead and crank this up to something pretty high, and I'll play back both of those hi-hat samples, and you can hear this effect. So it's not going to cut them off instantaneously. So you can hear the tail of that open hi-hat sample in the background. And if I put this down to an amount of 0, you'll see that it just cuts it off as soon as I trigger the other sample. So this can be useful if you're working with something like a string patch where we want things to ring out slightly. It can give you a little bit more natural of a sound. The final control in this menu is this exclusive groups control, which gives you up to 16 different exclusive groups. And what these let you do is link groups that are not in the same voice group. This is basically just another way of achieving the exact same effect that we have set here. So say, for example, we had a close hi-hat patch in one group and an open hi-hat patch in the other group. We can use the exclusive groups control to link those two so that it cuts off the other sample. You may want to do things this way because then you can apply different effects to each of those groups individually, as opposed to having them all in a single group. So let's go ahead and show you how that works now. So let's do closed hat. And then let's create a new group and name this open hat. And then let's go over to these groups and assign those. So let's go over to the open hi-hat sound, right click on it, move it to an existing group, which will be the open hat. So right now, whenever I click on this first group, you'll see that my voice count is set to 1, but let's go ahead and keep that. We can just keep that where it's at right now. Set it to an exclusive group number 1, voice group to voice group number 2, and set it to an exclusive group of number 1 as well. So now whenever I play back those samples, you'll hear that same choking effect that we had previously. And if I was to remove the exclusive group, you'll see that that sample rings out. So it's just another way of linking up groups so that you can limit the amount of voices that are being played back. The final option inside this group editor menu is the group start options. This is used to control how your samples are being triggered. You have several different options which you can choose from this drop-down menu. You can have the always option, which will play the sample whenever you hit the key. So that's what we have currently set up. You have the option to start on the key, which is a condition that lets you define key switches, which will disable a group of samples until you play a specific key range on your keyboard that's been predefined. So you can see that you could set that with these key range settings on this menu. So this is used to create various different key switching patches, which we'll cover a little bit later. The next option that you have on this menu is to start on controller, which means that the group will become active whenever Kontakt receives a MIDI controller data within a specific range. Then it'll deactivate again when the controller range is outside that value. You can see that you could set that from here. This is similar to the key switching mode that I previously showed you, except that it uses MIDI CC data instead of note data. The next option is this round robin option, which will cycle between samples whenever you press various different keys on your keyboard. This enables you to cycle through various different samples with just pressing one key. So let me show you how this works. We can go ahead and set this position to 1 so that our open hi-hat plays back first. Let's select the snare drum sample, go to round robin, set that to an amount of 2, and then we'll go to the kick drum, round robin, and set that to an amount of 3. So to show how this works, go ahead and pull all these samples on top of one another so they all trigger from the same note. So we'll put all 3 of those on top of one another. Then now whenever I press back this key, you'll see that it's cycling through each of those samples whenever I press a single key. So this can be great if you have 2 different snare sounds that are slightly different. You can layer them on top of one another and then use the round robin group mode to switch through those samples to give you a nice level of variation. The next control that we have on this drop-down menu is the cycle random, which is like the previous mode, the round robin mode, but it will cycle through each of those different samples at random, instead of being defined by their playback order like we did in this menu. The final mode that we have on this drop-down is the slice trigger mode, and this just had to do with an older version of Kontakt and was just left in there by the developers so that you can still load and edit those older patches. The cool part about this as well is you also have the option to stack these different trigger modes. So I have the option over here to do multiple trigger modes, so it'll accept a round robin trigger mode, and let's say a start on key trigger mode. Or you can do alternating trigger modes with the OR function, or do and not, so you can exclude various different trigger modes. This is used whenever you're creating more advanced sampled patches, and is what you use to get deeper levels of musical expression through more advanced key switching and things like that. So that's all for the group editor section. This section is really important whenever you want to start developing more advanced patches because it provides the organization and advanced structure for the different sample playback options for your patches. So that's all for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next video. In this tutorial, we're going to be talking about the Waveform Editor inside of Kontakt. For this video, we'll also be working with the drum sample from the Kontakt Factory library so you can follow along. So let's go ahead and grab the drum sample that I'll be working with. And that's going to be this African Night 87 BPM loop. That's just going to be under the Urban Beats section of the Kontakt Factory library. And this is the sample that we've used several times in the previous videos. I just figured we'd use this because it's a rhythmic sample, so it'll be a bit easier to see how the Waveform Editor works with the rhythmic drum sample. Let's go ahead and just click on that and drag it in. And this will create a new instance of Kontakt's instrument device with our sampler loaded into the Waveform Editor. So the first thing that we can do is select the Wave Editor button along this top menu, and that'll show our Waveform Editor. The Waveform Editor is used to edit the audio samples inside of Kontakt. This first video on the sampler is going to focus on the main controls that we can find on this window, and then in the next videos we'll talk more in depth about these menus along the bottom. So this can be broken up into 3 different sections. This top bar that has some navigation controls, this next section that enables us to edit the sample, and then also this waveform display. So the first controls that we have are the different zoom controls on the Waveform Editor. We can zoom in and out of our sample by pressing on these plus or minus arrows. Then once we zoom in, we can also scroll around by clicking on the scroll bar on the bottom. Alternatively, if you want to scroll in vertically into your sample, you can use these buttons to make that waveform display larger or smaller. So now let's move up to these controls along the top. These provide us the various different navigation features that we have in the Waveform Editor. The first one is this magnify tool. When it's enabled, clicking and dragging the mouse on the waveform will zoom into a specific section. And you'll see that now that area that we've zoomed into has filled up our entire waveform display. Whenever you click somewhere on the waveform again with the magnify tool enabled, it'll zoom back out. Alternatively, you can also achieve the same effect whenever this is disabled by clicking and holding Alt on your keyboard, and then clicking and dragging, or clicking on the waveform again to zoom back out. So that's just an alternative key command that can be helpful whenever navigating around your waveforms. This next button is the Jump to Zone Start button. Whenever you click this, the waveform view will jump to the start marker that's at the beginning of your waveform zone. So let's go ahead and zoom into a random point on our waveform to show you how this works. So right now we're about halfway through the waveform, and whenever I click on this button, it takes us back to the very beginning where our start indicator is. The next button is the Jump to Loop Start button. Clicking on this button will center the waveform view on the start point of your currently selected loop region. So let's go ahead and create a loop real quick in the sample loops. And then we'll adjust the start point here. And we'll cover the sample loops in detail in a later video, but just for now, we'll just create a basic loop. And then let me zoom into a random area here. Then whenever I press this Jump to Loop Start button, you'll see this now jump to the beginning of our loop. This next button, Zoom In on Loop, will fill up the entire waveform display with just the loop. You'll see that we have the beginning of the loop over here, and the end of the loop at the end of our waveform. Alternatively, if we zoomed into another area of the sample, this button at the very end, this Jump to Loop End, will take us to the very end of our loop sample. So now with that out of the way, we can go ahead and turn off our loop. Now I can show you what this next button does. This button is the Jump to Zone End button. What this will do is similar to this one over here, except that it'll jump to the very end point on your loop. So again, let's zoom into a random area, hit that button, and you'll see this taking us to the end marker on our waveform display. Now that we have the various zoom functions out of the way, we can go ahead and talk a little bit about the different snap modes that we have from this menu. This drop-down menu has 2 different snap options available for your loop regions. The first one, the Snap to Zero Crossing, will snap the start and end points of your loops so that it begins and ends at the point where your waveform crosses the 0 line. So to show how this works, let me go ahead and re-enable our loop real quick. And then we'll jump to the loop start point, and then I'll go ahead and zoom all the way in here. And we could zoom in one more time. So right now on our waveform display, the zero crossing is represented by this line that moves across, and this has to do with amplitude. So now whenever I adjust this loop marker, you'll see that it snaps to the point where this line is at 0. So it wouldn't snap at the very bottom of this peak, for example, or this peak right here. This will help remove any pops or clicks that may happen whenever the sample is looping back on itself if the waveforms don't perfectly line up. This next mode, the snap loop to value crossing, is similar to the other mode snap the loop to zero crossing, except it'll snap the start and end points to the nearest position where the waveform, value, and direction match up with the other end of the loop. So basically, instead of snapping to the 0 point, this line, it snaps according to the wave's contour and the wave's shape. It's just another way of matching up the start and end points of your waveforms so you don't have any pops or click sounds that may happen whenever your loop is looping back. So you'll see that it gives us the option to start our loop at this peak here, where it's not at the zero crossing, and it'll match up the endpoint as well whenever we zoom back into the other side of this. So let's go ahead and zoom in. And if we were to drag this over, and then zoom all the way in, it's going to match up the amplitude of that start and end point. So it's a little bit hard to see because that waveform display is so small, but just know that it's really similar to the zero crossing snap, except that it works off the contour of the waveform. So for now, we can just turn that off, and then we can zoom back out. And the next menu that we have is this command menu, which is represented by this icon. This drop-down menu gives you some basic utility features that you can use to adjust your loop's automatic start and end point in various different ways. And first, you want to make sure that your loop is enabled, or you won't see any of the options here. And the first one is the find loop end short. What this mode does is it makes Kontakt automatically try to find a good start and end point for your loop that'll keep your loop at roughly the same length. So let's go ahead and drag the start and end point here to something a bit shorter, so it's easier to see what's going on here. And then whenever I press this find loop end short, you'll see that it's adjust the end of our loop to what Kontakt thinks will be the best endpoint for our loop, but it'll keep our loop at generally the same length. Alternatively, the other mode that we have, the find loop end long, this will again automatically try to find a good endpoint for your loop, but it won't pay attention to the length that you've predefined with your loop indicators. You'll see that it's extended out our loop quite a bit. The cool part about this mode as well is it also checks the metadata of your audio file. Some waveform files like WAV or AIFF can store information about loop markers and sample end and start points. If any of that information is encoded into your audio sample, Kontakt will scan it, find that information, and then load it into the sampler. So that's just a really nice advanced feature whenever you're working with audio that has some metadata that's encoded into it. The next button that we have along the top is the follow playback button. Whenever this is selected, the waveform display will scroll as the audio is playing back so that you can see the portion of the waveform that's being played back. Let's go ahead and zoom out just a little bit and I'll demo this for you. So let's turn this on and start our playback. And let me even turn off the sample loop here because it'll be a little bit easier to see. The next button, as I just showed, is the stop button. So whenever you're playing back the sample with this button, the play button, you can stop it by clicking on this button. The control that's next to this is the loop control. Whenever this button is enabled, the play button next to it will play the currently selected loop region. So again, we can re-enable our loop and then play this back. So it's just focusing in on the loop region that we've defined by our sample loop control if we just wanted to hear what that specific region sounds like. The other control is the auto pre-listen. Whenever this button is enabled, Kontakt will play the region as soon as we select it or make a change to it. And depending on which tab is selected, this works in various different ways. This works with loop regions, slices, or edited sections. So let's say that I moved the loop start point whenever this mode was on. You'll see that the audio plays back every single time I make a change. So let's enable that, and then we'll change this. You'll see that that audio is being played back from the beginning of the loop sample anytime I make a change on the waveform display. The next button is the external editor button. Whenever you click this button, the current sample that we're working with will open in an external audio editor like Audacity or Adobe Audition, but you need to set this up beforehand in the Preferences tab. So to do that, it's actually really simple. Just go up to this gear icon, go down to the Handling tab, use External Wave Editor, and then you'll just press on this icon, and it'll pull up your computer's application settings. and then you just click on the application that you want to open this in, and then press open. Then everything will be configured to open in an external audio editor. If you're on Windows, that interface will look slightly different because the browsing features are a little bit different, but the same basic setup still applies. You'll just want to navigate over to the application that you want to use as your external audio editor, select it, open it up, and then Kontakt will set that as your preference. It's also worth mentioning as well, you want to make sure that the audio file that you're editing is going to be a WAV or AV file. So sometimes if you're trying to open up one of these loops from the Kontakt sample library, you can have issues whenever you open it up in an external audio editor. So if you ever get this error message whenever you're working with a sample in Kontakt, that's because it's one of the factory samples and they're not traditional WAV or AV files. So if you want to open something in an external audio editor, make sure it's a proper WAV or AV file. So now with that section out of the way, we can move on to this other top bar, this gray menu bar. This first controls that we have on here are controls that we can use to edit our sample, to swap it out. So we can use these arrows to navigate around the folder that we have our sample loaded into. So right now, this is the only sample that's in this folder. But if we had a bunch of samples and we want to audition the various different samples, we could swap them out with these arrows. The next control is the sample start control. This just controls the start point at which our sample is happening at. Let me turn off our loop indicator for now. So you'll see that whenever I change that, the beginning of our sample is changing. I can also click and drag on this interface as well. And same with this end control. Whenever I click on this, zoom out here, I can either click on the waveform display to adjust that, or I can click on this menu and get a bit more detailed of an adjustment. The other control that we have is the sample start modulation. And what this does is it'll control the amount that the start position can be modulated back and forth. This can help give a bit of variation to your patches, making them a bit more live and expressive. So whenever I press a key right now on my keyboard, it's always going to start from the start position. But let's go ahead and turn this up quite a bit. And you'll see now that we have this green line that's been added across the top of our sample. And this is the range that the sample start position can move around whenever we press a key. So this just makes the start position of our sample jump around a little bit whenever we start pressing our keys. The final controls we have along this top menu is this information about the format of our sample. So right now you'll see that this sample is in 44.1 kilohertz at 24 bits, and it also tells us the length of our sample as well. Once we're finished editing our sample, if we want to hide the wave editor, we can hit this X in the upper right-hand corner, and it'll hide our waveform editor. So that's all for this video on the waveform editor. Join me in the next video where we'll be taking a look at the next part of the wave editor, the sample editor tab, which can be found along the bottom. Thanks, and I'll see you there. In this video, we're going to be continuing our discussion on the wave editor inside of Kontakt, and we'll be focusing on the sampler editor panel. This panel is used to edit the audio content that you have loaded into the sampler. So we can move over to our wave editor, and then we could go to the sample editor, and that's all these options on this menu. The big difference between the sample editor and the other editing modes, which we'll cover in future videos, is that this specific sample editor uses something called destructive audio editing, meaning that it'll actually change the sample file rather than just giving you the ability to change a loop start position or adjust the pitch or tune of a sample that you can later change back at any time, like you could do down in this section. The changes that you make in this mode will directly affect this audio sample, and you won't be able to undo them at a later point. So you just want to keep that in mind. For this video, I have a simple drum loop loaded in that sounds like this. Also, sometimes whenever you're loading in samples from Kontakt's factory library, you may not be able to directly edit those samples in the waveform editor because this is a form of destructive audio editing. So if for some reason, whenever you load in a sample and you don't have the ability to select everything and then make a change, then you'll want to double check and make sure that you're working with a WAV or AV file so that you can actually edit everything. So in the instance of this sample, this is just something I loaded in from my desktop of my computer rather than something from the Kontakt factory library. So just keep that in mind. So the first control that we have in this section is the ability to select various different areas of our sample. What you can do is just click and drag to make a selection. And then if you want to make more detailed adjustments, you can enter in values in this menu right here. You can adjust the sample start time, the length control, or the end as well of the sample. The end and length controls are linked, and they're just two different ways of thinking about the sample's endpoint. Next to this, you have some nice undo and redo buttons. So you can undo the previous change. So let's say we made a change with one of the other modes. like we faded in a section and then decided that we didn't like it, we can undo it from this menu, or we have the option to redo everything as well. We also have this drop-down menu on each of these buttons. They'll give us a bit more detailed information about which functions we're either undoing or redoing. The next set of controls that we have in this menu is the edit controls. Once you have an area selected in the Wave Editor window, you can use these controls to edit the various sections of your sample. So you can either cut that section from the sample, and you'll see that it's removed that area, and then moved the rest of the sample over. So now our overall sample is a little bit shorter. And I'll show you that in a bit more detail here. So let's say we cut out this whole section. It's going to then link this section, this first section, with the end here. So now you'll see that we have this shorter sample. We can undo that. We have the option to copy a selected region. Then we can paste that selected region several times if we wanted to. So you can just click where you want that and paste it. And we can just undo that for now. You have the option to crop your sample down to your selection. So now our sample is just as long as that area that we had selected. You have the option to delete various sections of your audio. So it's removed that whole area. And you also have the option to duplicate everything as well. So let's say we had our entire sample. Want to take the sample endpoint all the way. We could duplicate that whole area. And now our sample is twice as long. The next tab that we have is the transform functions. These will give us various different audio effects to our audio sample that we can work with. The first of which is a fade in control. So let's say we wanted to make a selection at the very beginning of our audio. And let me just make some adjustments here. So let's say we wanted to add a fade in to the beginning of everything. We could select it and then hit this button. And it fades in our audio sample. So now whenever I press my key, we now have a short volume fade at the beginning of our sample. Same with the fade out control as well. You'll see that now we have this fade out. We have an option to add silence to our sample. So let's say we didn't like this part and wanted to make that area not play back anything whenever it got to that section. You could hit that button, and now we just have added a short silence to our selection. We have the option to reverse our selection as well. We could hit that button, and then now it sounds like this. But the section that we don't have selected has remained unaltered. We have a normalize control, which will bring up the volume of your selected region to 0, so it's as loud as possible without clipping. You'll see that it's increased the volume. And then the final control that we have is DC offset removal control. This will just remove any DC offset that you may have inside your sample, so that everything is moving accordingly to the 0 crossing line. So this section of the Wave Editor is pretty simple. It just gives you some more detailed control over the various components of your audio. You can add some nice effects, you can fade things in, or you can edit the actual sample before it's played back across the various keys inside of Kontakt. So that's all for this video. Join me in the next video where we'll be covering the other tabs in the Waveform Editor and showing you what each of them do. Thanks, and I'll see you there. In this video, we're going to be covering the sample loop section of the Waveform Editor inside Kontakt 6. The sample loop tab, which could be found at the bottom of this interface, is used to create loops in your audio material inside the sampler. So to demo this, I already have a drum loop loaded up, and it's the same African Nights drum loop that we've been using in the previous videos. And that's just because it's a little bit easier to show loop content on an actual drum loop. So inside the sample loop tab, you can have up to 8 different sections of looped audio. They can each have their own parameters set and have different behaviors for how each loop is played back. So we have the main on-off button for this entire section, which could be configured right here. And then we have 8 different loops, which we can go and turn off individually if we'd like. So let's say we only wanted to have loop number 1 on. We could turn off all the other loops, which we'll go ahead and do just for the sake of the demo. So now we just have one loop inside our Kontakt patch. And the nice part about this is the parameters inside each of these 8 loop slots are identical. So once you know how to use the parameters on one of the loop slots, it's the same for each of those individual samples. So to adjust the loop start and endpoints, you can either click and drag on the waveform interface to make changes. So you can scroll around the entire loop. You can change the endpoint or change the start point. And you also have the option to create more fine-tuned adjustments in this section as well. So you can adjust the sample's loop start time and the loop's end time here as well. So let's go ahead and make a really short loop here just for the sake of the demo. So far that sounds like this whenever I press a key on my keyboard. So it's just looping back that section of our drum loop. And then we also have this other control on here, the crossfade control, which will add crossfades between the audio loop start and endpoints, which is great for removing any sorts of pops or clicks that you may have on your audio material. And you can see that it's added this line, which shows us the section that's being crossfaded on our loop. So this gives us a bit more seamless of a sound. The next control that we have on this menu is the loop edit control. Whenever this is selected, you'll see this pop-up menu on the waveform display. This is basically just a visual way of editing the start and end points of your loop. So what we have on the left side here is the start point of our loop, which we can click and drag on this interface to adjust. So you'll see that we're moving around that start point, and we can also move around this endpoint as well. So you'll see right now that the zero crossing, which is represented by this line at the bottom here, which is a little bit hard to see on the interface, it's kind of small, but you'll see that these waveforms don't line up. So the start of our waveform ends about here, and then we jump down to the end of our waveform. So right now, whenever this is looped back on itself, you're going to hear a pop sound. So it doesn't give us a very seamless loop. But whenever I click and drag on this interface, we can move to a different point on the loop until we get something that lines up a bit better with our waveform. Let's maybe go just a little bit more here. We could do something like this. So you'll see now that these 2 points line up a bit better. This top point isn't perfect up here, but we could just focus on this for now. And actually, let's go ahead and just move that just a little bit more. There we go. This will work better. So you'll see that now our lines match up on our start and end points on our loop. So now it sounds like this. So now we don't have any sort of pops or clicks that are happening because we've lined up the actual waveforms of our start and end points on our loop. So this is kind of a cool way to visually adjust everything to get everything to line up a bit better. So it's just a different way of editing the loop start and end points. The next control that we have is the tune control. This control allows you to change the pitch of a loop section of audio while keeping the remainder of the sample's pitch intact. So let's go ahead and move this up to 12. So it pitches up a full octave. And whenever it plays back this loop first on its initial playthrough, it's not going to affect the pitch of the loop, but whenever it loops back on itself, you'll hear this starts pitching up the audio. So on that first playthrough, it doesn't affect the pitch of it, and then once it loops back on itself, it pitches that up an octave. The next control that we have is the loop count control, and this controls how many times a loop region will be repeated before Kontakt will play the rest of your sample. If this is set to 0, that means that the loop will repeat indefinitely as long as you hold down your key. And if I kept holding down my key, then it would keep repeating. So let's go ahead and put this up to an amount of 3. And then what will happen is it'll play back our loop 3 times, and then it'll continue to play the rest of our sample. So this is a cool way to add variation to our loops so that we can play our looped region several times and then continue to play the rest of our sample. So for now, we can go ahead and put that back down to 0 so that we just loop indefinitely. Then we can move on to the different loop playback modes. So the loop playback modes control how the loops are played back inside of Kontakt. So if we look at this drop-down menu, we have several different options. The first one, which is until end, will play the loop until the end of the loop indicator, and then we'll continue to play that loop over and over, which is what we have set up right now. So this is just the standard loop playback mode. The next control, the until loop end, forward and backward, will play the loop in alternating forwards and backwards directions indefinitely. So it'll play a reverse version of the loop after it plays the initial loop, which you can see represented visually on this interface. And this sounds like this. The next loop mode that we have is the until release loop mode. With this mode, Kontakt will play the loop in a forwards direction as long as the key is being held, and then once you release the key, it'll resume normal playback of the sample and play through the remainder of the sample. So to demo this, let's go ahead and scroll down to our Modulations tab and turn up the release of our sample so that after I release my key, it continues to play. And we'll cover the modulations in depth in a future video, but for now, let's just go ahead and turn that on. And then now whenever I hold down my key, it's going to loop that sample, and as soon as I release it, as you hear the volume fading out, you'll see that it continues to play the remainder of our sample. So this loop mode can be really great on sampled material like pianos. You could loop the note and extend it out as long as you're holding everything down. And then once you release the note, you can have a nice decay tail on the end of the sample. The next mode, until release forward through backward mode, is like the previous mode, except it'll alternate between playing the sample forwards and reversed until you release the key. And that sounds like this. The final mode that we have on here, the one-shot mode, will play the sample from start to finish and will ignore any loop markers that you have created. So it'll play from the start point that you have all the way to the end point, as long as you're holding down the key. The cool part about this is you can combine several different loops on the same sample. So let's go ahead and change this to until end. Let's create a really short loop. We could create a new loop and have this play forward to backward indefinitely. Then now whenever I press a key on my keyboard, it would combine those two loops and sound like this. So this lets us create really interesting and unique loop patterns in our audio material, and we could use up to 8 different loop sample slots. So you can get really advanced patterns out of your Kontakt patches with these loops. So that's all for this video on the sample loop section inside of Kontakt. I hope you enjoyed the video, and join me in the next video where we'll be talking about the next section of the Wave Editor, the Sync and Slice tab. In this video, we're going to be covering the Sync Slice tab inside of Kontakt's Waveform Editor. This tab in the Waveform Editor is used to edit and adjust the timing of your audio content. It's also used to slice up your audio samples and map them across your keyboard, so you can play back that audio sample in MIDI. So from here, you can do things like time stretching, adjusting the timing of your audio, or slicing it. So the first step for this is to pick a time stretching mode. And to demo this, I already have an audio loop loaded up. This is a drum set loop that I just loaded off my desktop, which we used in a previous video, and it just sounds like this. So it's just a simple acoustic drum loop. So you have 2 time stretching modes, the first of which is the Time Machine Pro mode, which operates just like a normal audio time stretching algorithm would in a digital audio workstation. But this specific time stretching mode does take up a little bit more CPU power, so depending on what you're wanting to do with the sample, you may also want to choose another mode. So when this mode is enabled, now whenever I play a low key on my keyboard, it's going to repitch the sample, but the original BPM will stay the same. So this is the original sample. And this is that same sample played several octaves down. And if we played that up a lot higher, whenever this mode is disabled, you'll hear that it still pitches up the sample, but it also speeds it up. Or slows it down if we play it at a lower pitch. So this mode's great because you can sync your audio loops and audio playback to your digital audio workstation's BPM. The next mode that we have is the Beat Machine mode. This time stretching mode is similar to the previous one, except it's going to play back your audio according to the grid values that you have set down in this section. So it's still a time stretching mode, but instead of time stretching like a normal audio algorithm would, it's based on the audio slices. Let's go ahead and turn this down to a lower slice value, so it's a bit easier to hear what this sounds like. So with this mode, the audio is still being slowed down, but it's jumping from slice to slice at the same BPM as the original sample. So whenever I play this back at higher note value, so if we have more audio slices, it would sound something like this. So this mode's nice for slicing up drum breaks, but can give you a little bit more of a glitchy sound, so just depending on what you're wanting, you could choose between the 2 different time stretching modes. So for now, we can change back over to the Time Machine Pro mode. Then we can cover this zone length control. And let's go ahead and turn down our grid to something like a quarter note so that everything's a little bit easier to see. And what we can do with this control is adjust the length of our sample. We can turn that down to something like 1 bar, 3 bars in length, or we can double click on this window and enter in values on our keyboard. We also have the option to click and drag on this end indicator to change the length of the sample as well. So now with those basic settings out of the way, let's talk about how to slice up audio samples and to map them across the keyboard. So let's go ahead and change the grid to an 1/8 note. And then what we can do is select individual slices of these audio samples that we'd want to use. So there's several different ways of selecting these samples. We can either click on an individual sample to select it. We can hold Command to select multiple samples at the same time. And if you're on a PC, this would be the Control button. Or if you wanted to select multiple samples that are all in a line, you could select your first sample, hold down Shift, and select the last sample that you want, and Kontakt will automatically select all the samples in between. Let's go ahead and do that. Let's select this kick drum sample. We want this hi-hat sample, and then also this snare. So I'll just hold Shift and click the snare sample, and it'll select all 3 of my audio samples. And then we can go over to our group editor and drag and drop that in. And what I'm doing is I'm just clicking on the interface and dragging. So let me just undo that for now and show you again what I just did. So if we click on our main sample, we'll click on this waveform here and just click and drag that into Kontakt. And just click and drag that into the group editor. And then now whenever I press these keys, you'll see that we have these 3 samples now mapped across our keyboard. The cool part about this as well is we can individually adjust the start and end points of each of these sample slices. So let's move over to the snare, and let's say, for example, we wanted to grab this end point here. We can move the end indicator, and then now whenever I press my sample, it now has the hi-hats. Or alternatively, we could remove those hi-hat samples to get a little bit tighter of a sound. This will just enable us to play back our audio samples on our keyboard. So what we can do with this section is we could take a drum loop, slice it up, and create a new drum pattern out of it by using our MIDI controller. Now let's cover the next section in the Sync Slices tab, which is the Auto Fade Times control. What this will do is add audio fades to the start point of each of your slices. Let's go ahead and turn this up to its maximum amount. Then let's click on our slices again and drag them into the group editor. And then now whenever I go over to my Zone Envelope tab, you'll see that we now have these envelopes that have been drawn on our audio waveforms. So actually, let's just select the sample, the snare sample. Let's zoom in a little bit, go over to the zone envelopes, and I can click on this and add more of an audio fade in, and that would sound like this. So now we have this volume fade happening at the beginning of our sample and a volume fade out as well. So this is really great because it can automatically add some volume fades to your sounds depending on what you're going for. And we'll cover the zone envelopes in more detail in the next video. So now with that out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about how to map this entire sample, this whole loop and each individual section of it across the entire keyboard so we can play back our entire loop. So to demo this, let's go ahead and take the grid setting down just a little bit. So we have quarter notes, so we have less slices to work with here. And then what we're going to do is turn the auto fade time down to 0. You can scroll down a little bit. And then we have several different controls here to control how our audio will be sliced up. We have this auto find empty keys, which when enabled, Kontakt will look for these regions that are empty, that don't have a sample mapped onto them, and it's going to map each of those loop slices to those empty keys. Or you could set this in manually by entering in a note here. Now let's go ahead and just disable the auto find empty keys for now, and make sure this is set to C-1. So you can click and drag on this interface, or just double click it and enter it in on your keyboard. And then to auto map everything, you can just click on this drag MIDI to host, and just click on it once and release. And you'll see that's mapped all those samples across our keyboard. So we can move our original sample over. And we'll just move that last sample there too. And now whenever I press these keys, you'll see that each of those individual samples is now mapped across our keyboard. I could scroll through those so you could see what we have going on here. And each of those individual samples is mapped across each key on our keyboard. Alternatively, if we wanted to have this MIDI pattern inside of our sequencer so that we could edit it inside of Ableton, what you can do is let's just move over our interface here, click on that sample, click and drag MIDI to host, and then just drag and drop that sample into your sequencer. And right now it's going to make a tempo signature adjustment. So we can hit yes so that it changes the tempo so that everything matches accordingly. And then whenever I open this up inside of Ableton, you'll see that it now has our entire MIDI loop laid out across our sequencer. So now whenever I play this back, it sounds like this. So we could remix that loop and add in another drum fill if we wanted to. We could take that snare and have it repeat twice for this section. So now it sounds like this. So this lets us easily slice up drum loops and create new and interesting patterns out of our loop material, which could be really great when working with drum breaks or percussion samples. So that's all for this video on the Sync Slice menu inside of Kontakt. Join me in the next video where we'll be continuing our discussion on the various menus within the Waveform Editor. Thanks, and I'll see you there. In this video, we're going to be covering the zone envelope section of the Waveform Editor inside of Kontakt. This section lets you create custom envelopes for the different parameters in your audio loop material, like volume and pan controls. You could think of this as a visual way of drawing automation on top of the waveform inside your sampler. So I went ahead and loaded up the drum loop that we used in the previous video, and then we can open that up and go over to the Wave Editor, and then inside the Waveform Editor, we can move over to the Zone Envelopes tab, and from here we'll be entering in those automation curves. So let's start with this column of buttons here in the middle. And these are the various functions that we can automate. You have the option of editing the volume, so you can click on that, and now we have an automation lane on top of our waveform. You can edit the pan controls, so the left and right audio channels. Or you have the option to add the last touch parameter so that you can automate it. So for example, if I wanted to automate the tune control on the group, I could click on this. You'll see that this now shows up as an Add Tune button. And then if I click on that, I can go into my audio waveform and create an automation lane that now controls the tune control. So you can select any automatable parameter inside your interface and then create an automation curve for it in the waveform display. The next buttons to the left give you additional features that you can use to control your zone envelopes. The first one is this visible envelope button, and what this will do is take you to the parameter in the modulation section that you're currently editing in the waveform view. So let's say, for example, I was editing the volume on my Kontakt patch. I could select the visible envelope button, and it takes me down to the modulation editor where I can see the parameter that I'm editing and also control the intensity of that modulation. And we'll cover the modulation section in depth a little bit later, but that just shows you what the visible envelope control does. Next, underneath that, we have a delete button, and this can be used to delete the envelope that you're currently working on. So let's say I had an envelope drawn into my waveform editor, and I didn't like it, and I want to delete it. I can go over to this delete button, and it'll ask you if you want to delete the envelope, and you can click OK. And then now our envelope has been deleted in the waveform display. The next control that we have in this section is this drop-down menu. What this does is shows each of the parameters that we're currently automating. So right now we just have the pan control automated. But if I go and select the volume control, the pan control, so let's move down to the tune control and select that, and then add the tune. And then from this drop-down menu, we'll see that we have the option to edit the volume, pan, and pitch. So you can select the various different envelopes from this drop-down menu as well, or you can select them from these tabs, so whichever is just easier. So now that we have the basic controls out of the way, let's talk about how to draw envelopes on the waveform display. So to demo this, let's go ahead and select the volume, because it'll be a little bit easier to hear what's going on. Then we'll go and select the visible envelopes button and make sure that the intensity is turned up all the way. And then what we can do is we go up into our waveform display, and we can add a point on the zone envelope by right-clicking with our mouse anywhere on the interface to add a point. So now we have this turning up in volume and then turning down in volume. So that sounds like this. You can also see that automation reflected if you watch the volume control on the amplifier section. So you can see that this light that's on the top of the control is moving whenever you have the audio being played back. Another way you can create breakpoints is by control clicking on this envelope. I hold control on my keyboard down and then click. I can create envelope points that way. And that control click option is the same for both Mac and PC. So if you're on a PC, you'll still be pressing the control button and then clicking on the interface. And then if I want to remove any of these envelope points, I can right click on them to remove them. If I want to adjust the curve that we have on this envelope, I can click on the circle and drag it up or down to adjust the curve of that envelope. So just to demo how this all works, what we can do is we can delete that currently selected envelope. Let's do something like the tune control. So we'll select that, and then we'll start by pitching up the sound, pitching down the sound, and going back up to its root key. We'll adjust that envelope. We also want to go down to the visible envelope and then turn our intensity all the way up so we have a more intense pitch modulation. So now whenever I press and hold a key on my keyboard, it sounds like this. So you can see that we can get some really interesting textures and sounds by automating the various parameters inside the zone envelopes. Alternatively, another way that we can create envelope modulations is by using this pen tool. So let's go ahead and delete our envelope that we're currently working on. And then let's make sure that the pitch is selected. So we'll select the tune control. We'll add that automation lane. And then you want to go in and turn on the grid, because if you don't have a grid value set, you can't use this pen tool. We'll turn this down to a quarter note, and then we'll select the pen tool. And then what this does is enables you to draw straight lines. So we can click on this section and drag it up, or we can click on this section and drag it down. And then don't forget, we'll turn up the intensity as well. So go down to the visible envelopes and turn that all the way up. So this just lets us draw straight automation lines. The length of these lines is determined by the grid value. If we wanted to make shorter lines, we could decrease our grid size and then draw in another curve. Or we could have longer lines by having a bigger grid value, and then we could draw in those lines. The next set of controls that we have are this cut, copy, and paste controls. And these function just like traditional cut, copy, and paste would on any other software. So what you'll want to do is first deselect the pen tool so that you can select everything. So make sure that this is not enabled, and then you can click and drag on this interface to select a section. So if you don't have your selection tool available, just make sure that this pen control is turned off. And then we can either cut this section, or we could copy another section and then click and paste it. So this enables us to cut, copy, and paste various different sections of our envelopes. The next control that we have is this envelope loop control. And what this does is create a loop that we can use on our envelopes. So let's just drag the start position and end position over slightly. We can make some adjustments to our curve here. Maybe do something like this. Then now whenever I play back my audio, you'll see that the audio is still playing through my entire sample, but it's going to continuously loop this section of the envelope. So over in this section, even though we don't have any automation that's drawn in, you can still hear the pitch modulation happening because it's just looping this envelope. The next control is the randomize envelope control. And what this will do is create a random envelope that has its length defined by our grid values. So let's go ahead and delete everything so far. So we have a blank slate to work with. We'll make this apply to the volume control. We'll turn on our grid value and change that to a quarter note. We can hit randomize envelope. And then you'll see that now we have a random envelope. And if I wanted to adjust the spacing in between each of these points, I could either increase that value, hit random again to get something that's a little bit more complicated, or I could make something simpler by reducing this grid value. Then I could go in and edit each of these individual points as I wanted, just like we can whenever we draw in our envelopes. The next control that we have is this copy current sample loop. So if I have a loop section in my audio, over in the sample loop section, so let's go ahead and create a loop, turn off our grid value for now. So if I have this section that's looped, I can go back over to my zone envelopes, select the parameter that I want to control like volume, and copy over the current sample loop, and then it copies over the start and end points of that loop. The final control that we have is this envelope follows playback speed control, and what this will do is whenever this is enabled, it'll adjust the entire speed of the envelope so that as I speed up or slow down my audio, this envelope responds in time with those adjustments. So if I play this on a higher key, it's going to play back this whole envelope at the same speed that the audio is playing back, or if I play it on a lower key, it's going to slow down the envelope so that it plays back in time with the audio. So I can turn off the sample loop. And this effect in the volume control is a bit subtle, so you also want to pay attention to the light on the volume knob on the bottom of this contact interface to see the automation as well. So what you'll be listening for is the change in volume that's happening over the course of the sample's playback. So what you can hear there is the volume is being automated so that the timing of everything follows the playback speed of the original sample. So that's all for this video. Join me in the next video where we'll be talking in detail about the grid panel on the Waveform Editor. Now we're going to be talking a little bit more in depth about the grid panel inside of KONTAKT. We've covered the grid panel a little bit in the previous videos, but I wanted to give it its own video because it has a few advanced features that we'll want to make sure that we cover. With the grid section, you have two different ways of chopping up samples. You have the fixed mode, which is used to create a consistent grid as defined by this value in this menu. And then you have the auto control, which will automatically scan the audio and will use transient detection to decide where it's going to place its slice markers. So as I said previously, the fixed mode is used to create a consistent grid on your audio slices. KONTAKT will do its best to find the tempo of the sample by itself, but if you already know the BPM of your audio sample, you can enter it in this bottom menu. So I know that this sample is in fact 128 BPM. This is just a really simple house drum loop that I created, which sounds like this. But let's say, for example, I knew that this was at 80 BPM. I could double click on this menu and type in 80. And then KONTAKT will create a grid that's based on 80 beats per minute. But for now, we can go ahead and put that back to 128. And then the controls that we have to the right of this is the half tempo button. So this will reduce the tempo by half, so it'll put it at 64. Or we can double the tempo by selecting this button. So if our sample was at something really fast, like 256 beats per minute, we could use this button just to double that tempo. We also have the option to adjust the time signature of our sample. So if we knew this was a 3/4 time sample, we could put 3/4 and then press enter. And then that would give us a grid value that's at this new time signature. And you could also double click on the bottom value to change that. So if we knew that this was something like 6, you could change that there. But we'll go ahead and put this back to 4/4 time. And then in the main section, we have the option to adjust the width of our grid spacing. So right now this is set to quarter notes, but if I wanted to make a finer grid, we could change that to 1/8 notes, 16th notes, or so on and so forth. And this will create consistent grid lines that are evenly spaced at every quarter note. You can see that those are marked by these blue flags that have been created at the beginning of each of our transients. The next mode that we have is the auto mode, which detects the transients that are in our waveform, which are just these high impact sections at the beginning of our patterns. So this is the kick and snare sample. So if we zoom in just a little bit here, we can see these a bit better. So the transients are just these beginning points where our audio spikes, and KONTAKT will scan for those transients and insert slice markers. The main control in this section is a sensitivity slider, which is used to automatically insert the grid markers. So let's go ahead and turn down this minimum slice duration for now to something like 10. We'll cover this in a bit more detail a bit later. But the way this works is it'll increase the sensitivity of our slices. So if we start in the bottom, we don't have a very sensitive slice marker. But as I increase this, you'll see that it starts to add more and more slices into our audio sample. This basically acts like a threshold control. The higher this value is set, the lower the volume spike has to be for KONTAKT to insert a new slice marker. This is also reflected graphically on the interface as well. If I put this down to something that's a bit more of a moderate value. And if we look around the bottom, so let's go ahead and put this about halfway. If we look right in this section, they'll see that there's actually this line that goes across the waveform display, and that's showing the threshold control. It's this thin blue dotted line. So it's a bit hard to see because everything's so small here, but just so you're aware that that's how our threshold is being set. So now let's go ahead and put the slider all the way up so we have a full sensitivity. And then as you may have noticed, in some of these sections right here, KONTAKT has created quite a few different slices for the same sample. I'll go ahead and zoom in to show you what I'm talking about. But for example, here we have the start of this kick drum, and then we have these other two slices, and then these slices at the end that we don't want because we just want to slice at the beginning, because we don't want slices that are midway through our kick drum sample. So what we can do to remove these is we can tell KONTAKT that there has to be a minimum length for each of our slices. And that's defined by this menu at the bottom. So let's go ahead and change this to something that's a bit higher value, like 240. And then you'll see now that KONTAKT has removed all those individual small slices that have been created in the middle of our waveforms. So this kind of helps just clean everything up a bit, and it'll help fix any of the issues that's being created by this automatic slicing. You can also click and drag on this as well to adjust the minimum slice duration. So let's change that back to 240. So let's say, for example, we had a little bit lower of a slice value. Now you'll see the Kontakt has missed some of our individual transients for the sections like the hi-hat. So if I wanted to go in and manually add a new slice marker, I can click this Add Slice Marker button. We can go ahead and turn down the minimum slice duration here. And then let's say, for example, I wanted to add in a new transient marker about halfway. I can go up and click along the top of this interface here, and make sure to click in this top bar or else you won't create a slice marker. But whenever I click along this top menu, you'll see that it's created a new slice marker, which can be shown by this gray line. Additionally, if I wanted to adjust the placement of each of these slice markers, so let's say, for example, I wanted to change the placement of this slice marker that's at the beginning of this kick drum. You want to make sure to turn off the Add Slice Marker button before trying to move one of the existing slice markers. And I wanted to start that slightly before the actual kick drum started. I could click along this top menu and then drag that slice marker, and it'll adjust the placement of that marker. Additionally, we have the option to click this Delete Slice Marker button, and then I can click on individual slice markers and delete them if I want to. The final option that we have is to lock the slice markers so they won't be edited by the sensitivity slider. So let's say I didn't want this slice marker to be changed. I could go ahead and select the lock slice marker. And then whenever I click on that, you'll see that it has turned gray. Just let me zoom in here. So this is now turned gray, where these other slice markers are blue. And then whenever I adjust the sensitivity slider, you can see that it's adding in these other slice markers, but it's not changing the currently locked slice marker. So if we hold Alt on our keyboard and then click the Lock Slice Marker button, now if we look at our interface, you'll see that all of these slice markers have turned gray, and that means it's locked each of our slice markers that's on our whole section. And the Alt key modifier is the same for both Mac and PC, so if you're on either system, press the Alt key and then click on the interface. So now whenever I adjust the threshold control, it's not going to edit any of those slice markers. So that's all for this video on the grid panel. Join me in the next video where we'll be covering the source module. Now let's cover the source module inside of Kontakt. This section is used as the main audio engine for your Kontakt patches. Also, the source module controls the playback engine for the selected group, so make sure if you're working with a patch that has multiple groups, you first select the group that you want to work with. And to demo this today, I have an acoustic drum loop loaded up that we used in a previous video that just sounds like this. So the source module is this section up at the top. So let's go ahead and select from this drop-down menu the first engine that we have, which is the sampler engine. And this gives us a few different controls over our audio samples. The first controls that we have on the left are the preset section, which gives us various different presets for each of the different types of modules that we have, so you can kind of test things out. And we also have the option to add modulation as well from the left-hand side, but we'll talk about that in another video a little bit later. So now let's talk about this first module, the sampler module. So this module operates just like a normal sampler module would. It takes the audio and tracks it across the keyboard. So the first control that we have is the tune knob, which just controls the pitch of our sample. And then if you want to reset that, you can either press Command on a Mac or Control on a PC, and then click on the parameter to reset it to 0. The next control we have is the MIDI input control. From this dropdown, we have the option to select the various different MIDI instruments that we want to control this specific module. So right now we just have it set to its default, but if you have multiple keyboards selected, you could use this drop-down menu to assign an individual keyboard to an individual group. The next control that we have is the tracking control, which will track out the pitch of the samples across the keyboard so you can play back melodic sequences. So if I have this off and I play several different notes on my keyboard, which you can't see in this case, but I'm playing 3 different notes on my MIDI controller, and they're all playing the same note because we haven't tracked out the pitch across our keyboard. But whenever this is enabled, you'll hear that now that pitch is being changed whenever I play different notes. The next control that we have on this module is the reverse control, which will play all the samples in the selected group in reverse. So whenever I turn this on, now I play everything back. And this was before. And then we have the release trigger control. This will start the playback of your audio samples after you release the key on your keyboard, instead of whenever you press the key. Whenever this mode is enabled, it also gives you several different options to adjust how this is triggered. So let's go ahead and just increase the time here. and I'll press a key on my keyboard, and you won't hear any audio, but I've pressed a key, but whenever I release it, now you'll hear that it plays back our sample. So this can be great to create all sorts of interesting articulations for your sounds. For example, if you're working with a string patch that has several different staccato notes being played, you could have it play one note whenever you press the key, and then whenever you release it, it could play another staccato note on the strings. So that's just an idea of how that could be used on an actual patch. The next control that you have on this dropdown is the high quality interpolation mode, which basically just controls the quality of your audio's playback. So whenever it's set to perfect, it's going to play back at its highest quality audio. But it's also going to take up more CPU. So if you want to reduce the strain of the CPU, you can always change this to something like standard. And it'll use up less CPU. In this specific example with a drum patch, because it's not very complicated, you don't really hear a difference whenever you switch between the various different modes. So in this case, I would keep it on the standard mode so that I don't use up a lot of extra CPU. So that's the first sampler module out of the way. We can go ahead and select the next sampler module, the DFD mode. And this mode has the same controls as the previous section, but the main difference is that it loads the samples off the hard drive into the sampler rather than loading them off of your computer's RAM. This is used whenever you're working with really large or really complicated patches like multi-sampled pianos or large orchestral libraries. So depending on what kind of patch you're working with, you may want to use this mode. The next mode from this dropdown is the Wavetable mode, which is one of the modes that was added in KONTAKT 6, so I'm going to be covering that in its own video in the next part. The next mode is the Tone Machine mode. This mode acts as a sort of granular synthesizer. So now whenever I press a key on my keyboard, it sounds like this. So what this is doing is slicing our audio into small slices, which are called grains, and then it plays them back in order to give us these really interesting, glitchy, textured sounds. So the first control that we have here is the tune control, which just functions as before. It'll adjust the tuning of our audio. We can press Command on a Mac or Control on a PC to reset that. And then we also have a pitch tracking and release trigger, just as before with the previous mode. And then the sections that we have that are different are the speed control. This knob changes the playback speed of your audio, but without affecting the pitch, which is one of the cool things you can use granular synthesis for. So you can either slow down your audio by turning it to the left, or you can speed up the audio by turning it to the right. The next control is the smooth control, which will just add crossfades between the different grains in your sampler patch. So if this is turned all the way to the left, we'll have no crossfades happening. So it sounds like this. And listen to the beginnings of each of the sounds. You'll hear little pops and clicks. So it can kind of help smooth out our patches to make them sound a bit more natural. The next control that we have is the format knob, which just allows you to affect the overall characteristics of your samples. So this is independent from the sample's pitch, but will kind of change the overall character. So if I turn this down, it almost acts as a sort of low-pass filter in a way, but it's changing the harmonic content. Whenever this is combined with the tune control, you can hear this a bit easier. So it can just add some interesting characteristics to your sound. Then we also have a DC filter offset button, which when enabled will remove any DC offset that we may have introduced by using these granular modes. And then we also have this mono legato mode, which is used whenever you're playing multiple notes at the same time. This will cause KONTAKT to start the second note at the current playback point in your audio sample rather than re-triggering that same sample from the beginning. The result is that you can play a melodic pattern on a sample like this drum patch without things getting out of time. So this would be whenever I play a sequence of 3 notes, and I'm going to hold them down as I'm playing the back, and you'll hear that things get pretty chaotic because it's a rhythmic sample. So everything's kind of out of time. Whenever I enable this and play back those 3 samples in sequence, Because the audio playback position isn't restarting at the beginning every single time I press a new note, it gives us a much more clean and musical sound. The next mode we have is the time machine mode. This is another granular mode and has some of the same controls as before, but the main change is now that it has this grain knob to control the length of the individual grains in your samples, and also this high quality mode. So let's go ahead and turn off the high quality mode for now, and we'll turn down the grain sample size here to its minimum value, and that sounds like this. So whenever I turn this up to its full amount, you can hear those individual grains being played back. Whenever I put this at a lower value, it creates a bunch of really small slices, so it captures a bit more detail in the playback of the audio. The other main difference on this section is this high quality button. And what this will do whenever it's enabled is Kontakt will analyze the sample data to find the best grain settings for the sample. So it'll automatically set this grain length for each individual part of your sample. So whenever I play my sample lower down, it's going to automatically set the length of those grains. And whenever I play my sample higher up, it's also going to automatically set those grains. Then whenever this is disabled, I can set my grain size manually. So that's all for the first part of this video. Join me in the next part, we'll be continuing our discussion on the source module. The next mode that we have on the source module is the Time Machine 2 mode. And this mode's similar to the previous mode, except that it has a better sounding pitch shifting algorithm. But it also takes up a little bit more CPU usage. It has some of the same controls as before, has a preset section on the left, has the drop down for MIDI control on the left as well, has a tune control, tracking, and release trigger. And it also has a speed control as well, so you could adjust the speed of your audio independent of the pitch control. But the main difference is that it now has these transient adjustment sections. So the first one that we'll be covering is this transient copy button. Whenever this is enabled, Kontakt will do its best to preserve the attack transients of your sounds, which is great for whenever you're working with drum loops. So to demo this, to make the change a little bit more obvious, let's go ahead and put the speed all the way down. So now it sounds like this. So it doesn't really sound like a drum set at all. But now whenever I turn on this transient copy, listen to the sound. So this would be before. And this is after. So it gives us more of an attack transient. And I can even push up the transient size. So whenever this is enabled, Kontakt's going to try its best to preserve the attack transients of your sound whenever you start repitching things around. The knob to the left of this is the transient size knob. So right now we can have a really short millisecond value. It doesn't preserve very much of those transients. Whenever I push that all the way up, you can hear more of that kick drum sound. So even though our speed is playing back at a much slower pace than the original sample, we can use these buttons and these knobs to preserve some of that initial transients. Then we also have the same mono legato mode as before, and then we have this drop-down menu, which enables us to set the length of our individual grains. So we can have really small grains or larger grains depending on what we're doing. So just to show you what that sounds like, if we were to put that on the large grain size, so we can get kind of different sounds depending on how long our grains are. The next mode that we have is the Time Machine Pro mode, which is similar to the previous modes, but it has an even more improved version of the time stretching algorithm. And this one definitely takes up the most CPU out of all of them, so depending on how large your patch is, you may want to use one of the other modes. But it has some of the basic controls from the previous modes like speed, tune control, tracking, and reverse. And actually for now we can reset our speed to 100. So I just press Command on my Mac or Control on a PC and click on that parameter. But this mode also gives you some more advanced controls whenever you go and enable this high quality mode. So the first of these controls is the envelope order control, and this sets the order of your spectral envelope, which controls the formants of your sound. If you're working with a piece of audio that's really low in pitch, you want to set this at a higher value so that it sounds a bit more natural. Or if you're working with a piece of audio that has a really high frequency texture, you're going to want to set this to a lower value so that it sounds a bit more natural upon playback. So that's all you really have to worry about for this parameter. The control to the right of that is the formant shift control, and this just shifts the overall formants of your sounds. So it just enables you to change the character of everything. And then this next control is the keep formants control, which will preserve the overall formants of your audio. So whenever it's not enabled and I start repitching my sound, we're going to change the overall character of our sound through the time stretching. Whenever I enable this keep formants, you can hear, especially in this snare drum sound, it brings back a lot of high frequency content back to our sound whenever I enable this. So now with this mode out of the way, we can go ahead and move on to the beat machine mode. This is used to sync the slices of your audio to our project's BPM or a host's BPM. So in this case, because we're loading Kontakt into Ableton, it's going to sync all of our audio slices up to 120 beats per minute, which is the BPM of our digital audio workstation. And actually, we're going to want to go into our Wave Editor and go over to the Sync Slice tab and turn on the beat machine. Then we can close out our Waveform Editor, and you'll see that the speed control has now grayed out, which means that now our audio is syncing to the playback of our digital audio workstation rather than the internal playback of Kontakt. So now it sounds like this. So now whenever I make a change to the project's BPM inside of Ableton, it's going to change the overall timing of our audio loop. So there's a few additional controls on here as well, the first of which is this slice attack time, which just adds a sort of audio crossfade to the individual audio slices. So if I was to turn this up, we'd get more of a crossfade at the beginning of our sound. Or if I was to turn this down, you're going to hear that there's a little bit more of pops and clicks at the beginning of our sound. So it just kind of helps smooth things out at the very beginning. And this next control, the slice release time, is the same, except it just affects the end of the audio sample. So whenever I turn this up, we're going to get more of a soft sound here. And we get a little bit more clicks and audio artifacts whenever this is set to a lower value. So you can just use both of these controls to kind of dial in your individual slices so that you don't have any weird pops or clicks that happen at the beginning and end of each of those slices. And the final control in here, the internal trigger button, is just used for backwards compatibility with an older version of Kontakt. So don't worry about this feature, as it's just there so that you can load older patches. The next mode that we have on this section is the S1200 sampler mode, and this mode emulates the time stretching and pitch shifting on an SP1200 sampler, so that it plays back your audio and reduces the quality in a really nice and textured way. So it gives your audio playback this nice 12-bit sampler feel. So this is without that mode, so let's go ahead and just put it on the regular sample mode and play back the audio. So you can hear, especially in that snare drum, you get lots of nice texture and audio artifacts happening on the high frequency content of your sound. The final mode that we have on here is the MP60 machine mode. And this mode automates the time stretching and pitch shifting algorithms on an MPC60 sampler, so it also reduces the audio quality in the same way that that vintage sampler would. So this would be before on the normal sampler mode. So you can hear this reducing the quality of the audio, almost adding a little bit of a sizzle and white noise to everything. This is also really fantastic whenever you're working with drum loops or individual drum one-shots, then these modes are really great to use. So that's all for this video on the source module. Join me in the next video where we'll be diving into the Wavetable module that was added in Kontakt 6. In this video, we're going to be taking an in-depth look at the Wavetable module that was added in Kontakt 6. A wavetable is just a collection of different audio waveforms all lined up one after the other. This enables you to morph between the different waveforms, which gives you these really nice textured and evolving sounds. The cool part about this Kontakt update is now you can do this inside of the sampler, so you can load in audio material or audio waveforms, and then convert them to wavetables that you can then use as synthesizer patches. So if you've already used the synthesizer Serum before and you have some expansion packs that have some other Serum wavetables, you can use those, or you can always go online and look for free Serum wavetable packs that you can use for as waveforms for the sampler. You can also take audio samples and resynthesize them into wavetables, and that's what we'll be doing today. So let's go ahead and drop in the drum loop that we've been working on over the last few videos. And we'll just make sure that that maps to everything here. And then we can close out the mapping editor and change the playback mode to the Wavetable engine. So now Kontakt has scanned this audio waveform, and it's going to ignore the pitch of our sample, and it'll just use the waveform data to create a wavetable. So now whenever I play a C note on my keyboard, we have this nice C note oscillator sound happening. So inside this mode, we have several different controls that we have from other modes on the sampler. We have this MIDI control where we can select our MIDI instrument that we want to control. We have some pitch tracking and release trigger controls. We also have a tune knob that functions the same as previous modes. So we can adjust the tuning of our sample. And then the main new control that we have is this position knob. This will morph between the different waveforms in our wavetable. So I'm going to hold down a note and I'm going to increase this position knob, and you'll hear that our sound is going to be changing and evolving as I change the position in the wavetable. So you can hear that now we have these single tones that we can use as oscillator sounds, but as I scan through that position control, it sounds similar to our initial drum loop. You also want to make sure that tracking is turned on. It should be turned on by default, but if it's not, you want to make sure that this is enabled so you can play back pitched sound. We also have a release trigger section from before, and then the other control that we have is this quality control. This menu gives you several different modes that you could use to set the quality of your audio's playback. So depending on the type of wavetable that you have loaded, this can affect the sound of your audio. So the effect on this specific wavetable is a bit more subtle, so this kind of just depends on your audio sample and also depends on how much CPU you want to take up. So if you have more available CPU processing power, it's better to set it on the best mode. The next mode that we have is this drop-down mode that gives us all these different ways that we can morph our wavetables. If you've ever used the synthesizer Serum, then you may be familiar with some of these different morph modes, like quantize, mirror, or the bending modes. So let's go ahead and put this on the quantize mode. And this almost gives it a redux style effect. So as I increase this form knob, it's going to increase the intensity of this waveform adjustment that's happening. And all these different modes can be used to adjust your waveform in various different ways. It would sound like this. So they're just various different waveform adjustments that you can have. And then the next control that we have is the phase control. This adjusts the position on the waveform where your sound will begin whenever your new note is triggered. So whenever it's set to 0, it's going to start at the very beginning of our oscillation. And whenever I set it to about halfway, it's going to start halfway through our waveform. So you can hear that that initial attack transient is gone. So that's with the attack transient, and this is without it. And perhaps a better way that's a little bit easier to see as well is I can show you this on an LFO. So let's just load up a sine wave LFO. And we'll cover this in a bit more detail later. I just want to show you this visually. So whenever this is set to 0, it's starting at this point on the waveform and moving through this oscillation. But whenever I adjust this phase control to about halfway, now you'll see this moving down instead of up as it did before, and then moving through this oscillation. So that's all the phase control is doing, is it's changing where your audio waveform is starting. So it's kind of just an easy way to visually see what's going on. The final control that you have on this section is the phase random control. And this is the same as the previous control, except that it's going to randomize the phase of your waveform. So whenever you increase this, it'll kind of randomly jump between different phases in your waveform, which can kind of add some nice subtle variation to your sound so that it gives everything a little bit more natural of a tone. So just depending on the type of sound you have, you can adjust that accordingly. So this wavetable engine allows you to take Kontakt and use it as a traditional wavetable synthesizer. You can take any sorts of combinations or pre-existing wavetables, load them into the synthesizer, and create a variety of different synth patches by using the inbuilt effects, filters, and sampler controls. So that's all for the Wavetable module inside of Kontakt. Join me in the next video where we'll start talking about how to use the effects inside of Kontakt. Now we're going to be talking about how to use the different insert effects inside of Kontakt, as well as how the different effects sections are all routed up. This video will focus on the insert effects on both the individual group level, so in this group effects section that we have, and then also the insert effects that we have that go across the entire instrument as well. The bus and send effects will be covered in a later video, so don't worry about those for now, as we'll be covering those in their own videos. So let's first start off by talking about how to edit the individual insert group effects. Those are the effects that are found in this section. So first, I have a simple drum kit that's loaded up that we used in one of the previous videos. It has a kick, a snare, and some hi-hats. And these are all loaded up into different groups so that we can apply effects to each of those individual groups. First, we'll turn off Edit All Groups so that whenever we make a change, it's just applied to one of the groups that we have selected. And applying effects at a group level like this is helpful because it enables you to apply something like a EQ, a compressor, or a filter to just one of these sounds. So for example, if I select the snare sample, now whenever I go and apply an effect, it's only going to apply that effect to the actual snare sound. And it won't apply that effect to any of the other sounds. So let's make sure that our snare sample is selected. And then we'll start talking about the group effects sections. So on the left-hand side, the first thing that we have is this preset drop-down menu. This will give us several different effects change presets that we can load. So we could load something like the 24-band EQ, for example, and it will give us these preset EQs that we can go in and edit. So we could press this edit button, and it gives us all the advanced options for editing these effects. You also have the option from this drop-down menu to save presets as well. So if I made a change to this that I liked that I wanted to be able to recall later, I could press Save Preset, and then I could save this into my Kontakt presets. And for now, we'll just press Cancel because we don't want to save that preset for now. And then we can also delete these currently loaded effects by pressing this X in the upper right-hand corner, and that will remove each of these individual effects. And then I can show you how to load up some effects onto our snare sound. So to add an effect, you have to press this plus button. If you press in this section right here, it's just going to flash. It's not actually going to pull up the drop-down menu. You want to make sure that you press right on the plus button. And then you have all these different options for different effects. So for this example, let's add a simple low-pass filter. And you have quite a few different low-pass filters to choose from. We'll just choose the first one. And another thing that's worth noting as well about these different effects is that even though the user interface of these doesn't look very exciting, a lot of these are actually really fantastic effects that Native Instruments also make standalone versions of as well. So just looking at the dynamics section, for example, you have the solid bus compressor, which models the bus compressor on an SSL mixing console. And I actually have the standalone version of this effect and use it in my mastering chains all the time. It's a really fantastic bus compressor. And then also the transient master as well is another transient shaper plugin that Native Instruments has. It's a standalone effect that they've added into Kontakt. So even though this doesn't look like it's a very good effect at all, the actual sound quality of these is fantastic. So it's definitely worth noting. For now, we can delete that as well and go back to our low-pass filter. So right now I can adjust this cutoff point to change the sound of this effect. So on my snare sound, it sounds like this. So it's just cutting out all of those extra high frequencies. And because we've loaded this effect onto the individual group within Kontakt, whenever I play my kick drum sample, no effect is applied, but whenever I play my snare drum, that effect is applied, because everything's loaded into these individual groups. So if I wanted to apply that effect to the kick drum sound, I could select the kick and then apply that effect in this section. You also have the option to bypass the effects as well. So I could click this bypass button to bypass the low pass filter. So this can be nice whenever combining and auditioning effects. And then you also have the option to drag to reorder your effects as well. So let's say we had several different effects. We had a equalizer, a compressor, and then that filter. And let's say that we wanted to have this compressor go before the filter. I could just click on it and drag it. So now the compressor is first in our signal chain, goes into our low pass filter, and then into our equalizer. And for now, I can just remove those. And I can even add back in the low pass filter. And you also have the option to load presets for the individual effects inside your signal chain. So just like you can use this dropdown to load these different presets, you also have the option to load presets for the individual devices. So because this specific effect is such a simple low pass filter, it doesn't have any presets available. But if I loaded something that was a bit more complicated, like an equalizer, let's just add in the equalizer, the solid G equalizer. And I go to this preset menu, you'll see that now we have all these different options that we can use on our sound. So we could load the vintage preset, and that just sounds like this. So it's applying all these different equalizer curves to our overall sound. The next section that we have to the right of this is the post-amp effects section. This lets you add audio effects that take place after the amplifier section at the bottom. So the current effects routing that we have is everything moves from our sampler into these insert effects, and then goes from these effects into our amplifier section. But what this allows you to do is to add an effect after this amplifier. So you could have the go from the sampler, into the equalizer, and then we could have it go down into the amplifier, and then go into something like a modulation effect, for example. So it's just a different way of routing your effects so that you can have effects that happen after the amplifier section. So by default, you only have 2 post-amp effects slots on this section. If you wanted to increase that, you could just increase this number here by clicking on it and dragging. And now you'll see that it has moved this gray box that outlines everything. And now we have the option to add 5 different post-effects slots, or if we wanted to keep everything as insert effects that happen before the amplifier, you could just drag that down to 0, then you'll get those 2 extra insert effects slots. So now with this whole section out of the way, we can move down to our instrument insert effects section. So by using this section of Kontakt, it enables us to add effects devices that will be applied to our entire instrument device. So whereas previously that effect that we had, the low pass filter, was only applied to the snare sound, in this section we can apply something like a reverb that would go across our entire instrument. It has some familiar controls on this section. We have the presets window just like before, and we also have the edit button that will enable us to edit all the currently loaded effects. We can go ahead and add in some effects. So from this dropdown we can choose the different effects that we want to have. It's also worth noting that we actually have some new effects devices that we aren't able to load in on the group insert effects, like reverbs and these delay effects. These are effects that can only be loaded either onto a send, a bus, or an instrument, and can't be applied at the individual group level. So let's go ahead and add in the new reverb that was added in Kontakt 6, which is this nice room reverb. Then we can even go and add a preset from our factory sound bank here. Could do maybe a large hall since we have a drum set. And that sounds like this. So there's quite a bit of pre-delay, so let me just turn that down. And as you can hear there, now this reverb is applied to both the kick drum, the snare drum, and then also our hi-hat. One thing that you also want to be aware of as well is if you're loading presets from this menu up here, sometimes you may get an error that the preset won't work for this section, and that's because it includes one of these time-based effects like reverbs or delays. So if you get that error, for example, let me choose one of these from the dropdown. Go ahead and do the synth effects. So if you get this error that says this preset's not allowed here, that means that it includes a time-based effect like a reverb or delay unit, so you can only load that down in this instrument insert effects section. So that's what's happening if you ever see that error. Now, depending on what type of effect we choose, you might also see these different dry-wet controls. These are used to control the intensity of effects like reverbs and delays. The dry slider controls the volume of the original sound, so if we turn off the wet signal that we have below it, you'll just hear whenever I play this back, no reverb signal that's happening. And the inverse is if I turn up this wet signal all the way and turn on the dry sound, you're only going to hear the sound of the reverb. Now, let me turn that down just so it's not too loud. You could use these 2 controls to blend the effects to get the sound that you want. So we could have something that has just a little bit of the reverb and more of our dry signal. That way our sound has a nice presence to it, so the drums sound nice and upfront. Then we have this kind of reverb that's hovering in the background of the sound. Or alternatively, we could have something that's a little bit more ambient with more of the reverb signal and less of the dry signal. So these just enable us to configure effects in various different ways. So that's all for this video on the insert effects inside of Kontakt. Join me in the next video where we'll be covering how to configure the send effects. Thanks, and I'll see you there. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our discussion on the effects controls inside of Kontakt. In this video, we're going to be covering how to use these send effects. The send effects are effects that run in parallel to the main instrument channel. This allows you to send some of the original track signal to that effects bus. The result is that it leaves your original audio signal intact, and it allows you to blend your affected signal on top of your original signal. This can be great for effects like reverb and delay that tend to get a little bit too overpowering if they're used as an insert. So you can create a complicated effects chain and then blend it back in with your original instrument. So this just helps keep all your levels in check and helps everything sound a bit cleaner. So to demo this, I have the same drum patch from the previous video, which just sounds like this. And we're going to be applying the different send effects to this drum patch. So there are 2 ways to route audio to the send effects. We can either route them from an individual group insert effects slot. So for example, if we just wanted to have a reverb on our send channel apply just the snare sound and not the kick or the hi-hat sample, we could do that with the sends in the group insert effects section, which is what we'll show first, and then I'll show you how to apply send effects to the entire instrument device. So let's go ahead and create some send effects with the reverb and delay using the room reverb and the replica delay that was added in Kontakt 6. So what we can do is scroll down to our group section, which is where we'll be adding our effects. And first, let's actually make sure that the snare is selected, the snare group, and turn off Edit All Groups so that we don't accidentally apply these effects to everything. And then what you'd have to do is from this drop-down menu, you need to go down to Utilities and select the Send Levels control. This will enable you to send your audio signal to the insert effects. So now we have that effects device loaded up. We can go down to the section marked Send Effects, which has some presets in it and it has the same edit button, just as the other effects devices did. And from this drop-down menu, we can go and add a replica delay, and we can also add in a reverb unit. Let's go ahead and add in the room reverb that was added in Kontact 6. So now if we scroll back over to the snare group, we have one that enables us to send signal to the replica delay, and one that enables us to send signal to the reverb. So what we'll do to start is go ahead and turn these all the way down. And I'm actually going to remove the send that is automatically loaded up on the insert effects, so you don't have anything happening there, because this creates a send effect for our entire instrument device, which we don't want to do for now. So I'll just remove that. And then how you configure these is you increase this knob to apply more of that effect. So what this is doing is sending more of the audio signal into the delay. This sounds like this. So you can hear that more of that delayed signal is applied whenever I increase that knob. And this works the same for the reverb as well. So if I play it right now, you're not going to hear any of the reverb signal. But if I was to turn this knob up slightly, you'll hear more of that signal. And as I increase it, you'll hear more of that signal as well. And you can also see that reflected on these meters. So this one, this marked number 1 is for a replica delay, and the one that's marked number 2 is for the reverb. And from here, you also have some familiar controls like presets. So you have this preset to set everything to negative infinity so that you don't hear any audio. And then you also have the option to set everything to 0 decibels. So those are just some options that can make loading everything a bit quicker. And then you also have a bypass as well. So if I was to have this not bypassed and I was to turn down my replica delay and turn down the reverb slightly, now you can hear the effect again. Additionally, on the individual effects devices, you have this knob marked Return. And this is on every one of the send effects. So this is on the replica delay and also on our reverb unit. And what this is the overall volume of this effect. So we're sending audio data to the insert effect, and then the audio data is being routed back into Kontact Mixer. So even if I'm sending audio data to this effects device and I turn this return all the way down, you'll see that it's sending audio data, but nothing's coming out of this effect because I've turned down the level of it. What I could do from here is increase that level and you'll start to hear that effect again. So this enables us to blend the overall level of our effect. So we can send a lot of our drum signal into the effect to get a really big reverb sound, but then we could turn down the overall volume so that it's more hovering in the background of our mix. And because these insert effects are loaded up onto the individual groups, whenever I play something like the kick or the hi-hat channel, the effects will not be applied to those because we have it set up on a group level. So now let me show you how to apply an insert effect so that it affects the entire instrument device. So let's go ahead and remove the one that we have on the snare group. And then we can go down to our instrument effects, click the drop down, go down to utilities, and click send levels. This will apply both of our effects to each of the individual sounds within our instrument device. So now the entire instrument device has all the different insert effects applied to it. These different send levels, the presets, and the bypass controls all function in the same way that they did on the insert effects on the group. It's just a different way of applying the same effects. So that's all for this video on sends. Join me in the next video where we'll be talking about how to modulate the various different parameters inside of Kontact. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next video. Hello everyone, and welcome back. In this video, we'll be covering the various different ways you can modulate different parameters inside of Kontact. So rather than covering every single modulator, I want to focus on one key type of modulation from each of the different sections, so it gives you a good idea of what's possible with the modulation section inside of Kontact. Then going from there, you'll have all the information you need to explore the other modulators that you can have that we don't cover in the video. So by default, the patches inside of Kontact already come with a very basic volume modulation setup. This is a volume automation that's being applied to the amplifier envelope, and that can be seen down in this section. Now to demo everything today, I just have the drum loop from the previous videos that's loaded up that sounds like this. So as I said previously, this modulation envelope is by default applied to this volume control. So on this envelope, we have several different controls that can control the overall volume of our sound. The first of which is this attack knob, which whenever I increase it, will add a short volume fade to the beginning of our sound. And this would be without it. And then the control next to it, the curve, affects the way that this attack curve is set up. So I can adjust it and have it kind of bow out like this. Or I can have it be a bit more snappy. So it just depends on what you're looking for. You can just command click that or control click on a PC to reset it to its default state. And then next we have this hold control. So the default envelope inside of Kontakt is a little bit more advanced than some of the other envelopes you may have in some basic synthesizers. This envelope is referred to as an AHDSR envelope. So it's adding this hold parameter in the middle of the envelope, where normally you would just have a decay control. So what I can do to show this off is turn down the sustain and decay. And then I can turn up this hold, and you'll see that after we move through this attack, it's going to hold our sound at this volume before it decays down to whatever the sustain point is set to. So that just sounds like this. So it's holding it at this maximum volume here, and then moving down to 0, which is set by this decay parameter. Let's go ahead and turn the hold down all the way, and I'll show you what this sounds like. So it's adding this fade out to everything. Could even increase that a little bit. So that's set really long. Then the sustain parameter is the volume at which your sound will sustain at once it moves through the attack, the hold, and the decay settings. So it's going to move up to 0 decibels, its maximum volume, and then dip down along the decay curve to its sustain volume. And then it'll hold there until I release the key. You can see that even after it moves through this decay, it's still holding out at negative 19 decibels. And the final control that we have on this envelope is the release control. This controls how long it takes for our audio to fade out after I release my key. So let's go ahead and make this a little bit easier to hear. Let's turn all these parameters down to 0, turn the sustain all the way up, and we'll turn the release down all the way. So now whenever I release a key, the sound automatically cuts off, but as I increase the slider, you'll hear that it has more of a fade out. So this whole envelope modulation just allows you to sculpt the various different volume contours of your sound. They're using all these different parameters. The next control that we have along this envelope is the AHD button. This simplifies our volume envelope and just gives us a curve, an attack, a hold, and a decay setting. So it enables us to make simpler modulation curves in something like this. So you can just use this if you want a simpler automation curve to work with, or if you're looking for a slightly different sound. The next parameter is the retrigger button, which will retrigger the envelope every single time I press a key. Let's go ahead and turn down the attack here. We'll turn up that decay. And then whenever this is enabled, every single time I press a key on my keyboard, it's retriggering. And actually, this will be a little bit easier if we turn up the attack a little bit. So this is with the retrigger enabled. Every single time I press a key, it's restarting that volume fade at the beginning of our sound. But whenever I release this, I can play back several different notes in sequence, and you'll hear that it keeps repeating and moving through this envelope. So it doesn't give us a consistent sound every single time we press a key. From here, we also have some other controls as well. We can bypass our envelope. Just like before with our insert effects section, we have some different presets. So we have some different factory presets that we can use. So we can have a default state, or we can choose something that's a bit more interesting, like a short decay preset, for example. So it just depends on what you're looking for. I'll go ahead and reset that to its default. And then you also have the option to modulate your modulators in Kontakt as well, which can give you some pretty nice advanced features. So for example, if we wanted the velocity of the keys that we're triggering on our keyboard to make our sustain point play back at different volumes, we can do that with this section. So we can add a modulator, which in our case will be the velocity, so how hard we're hitting our keys, and then From here, I can set this to sustain. So now watch this orange light whenever I play my key really softly. And then watch light whenever I press really hard on my key. And then here's that key really soft. So you can see that it's changing the overall volume of our sound by changing the sustain point. So you can get really interesting and expressive patches by using things like velocity modifiers on your modulation envelopes. So for now, I could just delete this entry by clicking on it and then pressing the delete key. And then let's go ahead and make sure that this is set to its default state. So now that we have the amplifier envelopes out of the way, we can move on to the various different types of modulations that we can set up and how to configure this for individual parameters. So we can apply this to other things that aren't volume, like we can put this on the pan controls or the pitch, or modulate any of our effects. So to assign a modulation entry to any parameter, you can just right click on it and then select how you want to modulate the signal from this drop-down menu. You have the option to do external sources, which is what we did with the velocity. So I can assign that to the pitch control, for example. I can turn this all the way up so that we have a more intense pitch modulation. And as I play really soft, we can turn this back down to its default state. Make sure to turn this all the way up. So it's the velocity that's controlling the pitch. So this sounds like this whenever I press the key really softly. And whenever I press the key really hard. I'm pressing the same key, but pressing it at different velocities, and it'll repitch our signal. So that's all for the first part of this video. Join me in the next part. We'll be continuing our discussion on the modulation section. So let's go ahead and assign this to another modifier inside of Kontakt. We also have the option to assign LFOs, external envelopes, which is what we did down here in the modulation section. We have some other more advanced features, which we'll be covering in its own video. And then you have the option to assign it to existing parameters as well. So if I wanted to assign this pitch control to my current volume envelope, this envelope down here, I can assign that from this menu. So now let's talk about how to use the LFOs inside of Kontakt. There's quite a few different LFOs to choose from, but they all function in the same way. So once you understand how to use one of these LFOs, you can use all of them. Let's just assign this to the sine wave, and then turn the intensity all the way up. And that sounds like this. So what this is doing is mapping the pitch of our sampler instrument to the contour of this waveform. So it's moving our sound up and then down in pitch and then back up again. You can also see that reflected on this light as well. So on our LFO modulation entry, we have several different controls that we can use to modify our sound. The first of which we've already covered in a previous video. It's this intensity slider, which just controls the intensity of our modulation. So if we have this turned down, we're going to have less of a pitch modulation. Or if we turn it up, we're going to have more of a pitch modulation. We have the name of our modulation, so it tells us that this is an LFO that's a sine wave. We have this quick jump button, which will jump us down to the LFO, which we'll be taking a look at here a little bit later. We have the option to invert our modulation. So instead of pitching up at the very beginning, it's going to be pitching down at the very beginning. So at first, it sounds like this. And if this is inverted, it's going to move down instead of up. So that'll just change the overall character of our sound. And we also have this control, the lag control. This control will smooth out your modulation signals. It can be great whenever you're using external modulation sources like a modulation wheel or a pitch bend wheel, and this will help make everything sound a bit smoother. So if you have an automation source that's a bit more choppy and unusual, then you can use this. You can click on it and increase the value to kind of smooth out your automation curves so that everything feels a little bit less jarring. You can also double click on it and enter in a value. So we'll just turn that back down to 0 for now. And then let's cover this modulation shaper section. This section allows us to draw our own modulation curves. Then the LFO or other modulation source that we currently have loaded up is going to follow along this modulation curve. This functions very similarly to the modulation curves that you have in the zone envelope that we covered in a previous video. So it gives you some interesting options that you can use to kind of change the way that your modulation is happening. So to show you how this works, let's go ahead and turn on active so that we can see our automation curve. And right now it's just going to move from start to finish, so from 0 to 100, and it sounds like this. you could see this white line that's appearing as well. And that represents the LFO modulation that we have going on. So it's just a sine wave, so it's just moving back and forth. But if we were to change this waveform to something like one of the other modifiers, like a sawtooth, now watch this waveform. So it's changing how this is played back. We'll go ahead and turn that back to the sine wave for now. And then if you want to make changes to this curve, you can add points by right-clicking to add a point. You can right-click again on the points to remove them. And then if you want to adjust the curve that you have entered in here, you can click on the orange circle and drag it to adjust that curve. So we can make something quick like this. So now our LFO is going to map its intensity, the pitch modulation, across this waveform that we've entered in. It's going to move back and forth along this waveform to give us this advanced pitch modulation. And also, it's worth noting as well with this, that the lower something is down in this menu, the lower the pitch is going to be. And the higher up something is, the higher the pitch is going to be. On the left-hand side for this menu, you also have some factory presets as well, which you can use to get started. So you have something like reverse, which will reverse your waveform. You have things like pitch bend down only, which enables us to use a sine waveform, but to only pitch down our signal and not pitch it up. Because without this, it would be a curve something similar to this. And it would pitch up and down our sound. So it just gives us a whole different level of control over the individual modulations that we have set up inside of Kontakt. Additionally, you also have this option on the left as well, which gives you another way of entering in your modulation curves. So instead of drawing everything in clean lines, you can enter it in as these individual bars and steps. You can also click and hold it to drag and draw shapes, which just gives you a different way of entering in information that you may find helpful. Final control that we have on this whole upper menu is the modulation target menu. So you can just click on this to see what you're currently modulating, which in our case is just the pitch control. And then if I wanted to remove this modulation, I could just click on this entire entry and press the delete key on my keyboard. And that's for both Mac and PC. It'll remove that modulation entry. You can also see that reflected because it's removed our LFO down here at the bottom. Let's just go ahead and add back in that LFO. And then I'll show you the controls that we have down here on the actual LFO window. So the first one is frequency. This just controls the speed of our waveform. So you can see that we now have more waveforms in this one window here. And that represents the fact that it's going to be moving faster. You also have the option as well, if you want to sync this to your project's BPM, you can click on this window and select preset lengths that'll be in sync with your song. So you could do eighth notes, for example. And those will be configured by our project's BPM, so we could put this down to something plays back pretty slow, or we could put it up to 175. And this changes the LFO speed based on our project's BPM. So this can be great for creating different rhythmic sounds or using it in an actual project. So for now, I can go ahead and bring this down a little bit. And then we can move on to this fade in control. What this will do is just fade in our modulation, which you can see reflected on this window, and you can also hear it whenever we play back the audio. So it almost gives us a sort of interesting modulated pitch shuffle, which could be nice to create some interesting rhythmic variations. The next control that we have is the phase control, which just controls the point at which our waveform modulation starts. So if I was to increase this, you'll see that now our modulation starts by going down in pitch and then up. Or if I was to change this back to its default state, you can hear that the pitch moves up whenever it's starting off. We also have this re-trigger button as well. So whenever this is turned on, every single time I press a key, it's re-triggering the envelope, just like it did here. And whenever this is turned off, you can hear it still cycling through that waveform even when I trigger different notes. We also have the same bypass, preset, and modulation options available on the left-hand side as well. So for now, I can just delete that envelope modulation. And then we have several different options as well from the envelopes, which we've already covered the basic envelope in depth. We also have some additional envelopes as well, which just have the same features that we previously discussed, but just different ways of adjusting them and interacting with your signal, which can be helpful. You have this other section, which has these various different kind of more obscure modulations. And we'll actually be covering the 32-step modulator in its own video, because that's some really nice advanced features that are actually quite useful. Then finally, we have the existing control, which whenever you select this, it'll just assign our modulation that we have to our existing envelopes. So right now, if I was to turn that up and bring the attack up on our volume envelope, you'll hear that it's going to fade in our signal's volume and also fade in the pitch. So this is great because you can take an LFO and you can assign several different parameters to that same LFO or envelope to get more advanced and complicated modulations that you can easily control with just using one parameter. So that's all for this video on modulation. Join me in the next video where we'll be diving a bit more in depth into some of the different modulation sections and covering the step modulator in detail. In this video, we're going to be taking an in-depth look at one of the more creative modulation devices in Kontakt, the step modulator. This is used for both modulating effects and sampler controls, as well as creative note sequencing as an arpeggiator. So to demo this today, I have a simple drum loop loaded up that we used in one of the previous videos. That just sounds like this. And we'll just use this because it'll be a bit easier to hear whenever we have changes on our modulation. So let's go ahead and open up the patch. Then let's assign the tune, the pitch of our sound, to the 32-step modulator. We can also turn up the intensity all the way. And then we'll click the quick jump button, and it'll jump down to our modulator. So now whenever I press a key on my keyboard, it sounds like this. So you can hear with this previous example, it's changing the pitch of our drum signal as it goes through this modulator. So the first set of controls that we have on this device is the step number. This lets us configure the amount of steps we want in our modulation menu. Now we're going to go ahead and drag this down to an amount of 4. So I just double click on this and then press 4 on my keyboard. And then now it gives us 4 different steps in our modulator. And this can go anywhere from 3 steps to 32 steps. So I can go all the way down to 3, or I can go all the way up to 32. So the way that this works is whenever I press my key on my keyboard, it's going to play through this modulation. So it starts off with this first modulation, and the intensity is just set by this slider. So if I wanted to pitch it up more, I would increase this amount. Or if I wanted to pitch down my signal, I would move this menu down. So right now it's starting at a lower value. And then after it finished going through this section, it would move on to the next section. So we could turn that down in pitch and maybe have this somewhere at about halfway. So that would sound like this. So it's starting off at a higher pitch, going down to a lower pitch, and then going back down to these more mid-range pitches. So it's important to note here as well, you have both the options to insert positive and negative values on this device. So if I'm working with something like a filter cutoff, I'd be working with just positive values. So this would be at 0, and this would be at 100%. But because we're dealing with pitch, I can pitch down my sound, so negative values. So for example, negative 12 semitones, or I can go plus 12 semitones. The next control that we have is the frequency control. This just controls the playback speed of this modulation envelope. So if I increase this, it's going to play back at a faster speed. And if I was to decrease this, you can hear it play back at a slower and slower speed. The next option is the retrigger button. Whenever this parameter is enabled, it'll retrigger our envelope every single time I press a key. So right now, because this is enabled, I'll just press my key repeatedly. You could hear it's always starting off at the very beginning of this envelope by pitching up our sound. But if I was to turn off this retrigger, Kontakt's going to play through this envelope regardless of whenever I press my key. So even though I'm going to be pressing keys multiple times, it's not going to retrigger this envelope from the beginning. Let's go ahead and reduce the speed here because it'll be a little bit easier to hear. So even though I'm pressing notes continuously, it's jumping around in pitch because it's just playing through this envelope. So it's not going to re-trigger. So depending on the type of modulation you want, you can either enable this parameter or disable it. The next parameter is this one-shot mode. which whenever it's enabled, it'll play through our entire modulation once, and then it'll stop and go down to 0. The next control that we have is this Tools drop-down menu. We have two different options, the first of which is this Reset control, which will just reset our envelope to its default state so that we can enter in a new patch. This works just like an initialized patch would on a synthesizer or sampler device. It's the same type of thing going on here. And then the second control that we have is the Snap 1 through 12 control. This gives us the option to enter in specific note values into our modulation matrix. So to demo this, let's go ahead and load up a synthesizer patch because it'll be a little bit easier to hear what's going on. So let's go to the Kontakt Factory library. Let's go out to synthesizers, lead synthesizer, and then go down to the poly detuned lead. And that's this one. And we'll go ahead and just drag and drop that into Kontakt. And then we can also remove our drum loop. And you'll see that we have this lead loaded up. The final thing that I want to do is just bring down this cutoff just a little bit so we don't have too much high frequencies going on. Let's go ahead and turn the MIDI channel to Omni. And then let's go to the Tool menu, click the Tune knob, load up the step modulator, turn the amount all the way up, and go down to the step modulator, reset the device, and turn on this snap control. You can also put this amount down to 4 as well. And then now if we pay attention to these different grid values, you'll see that we have 12 different grid spaces going up and 12 different grid spaces going down. So now whenever I draw something in on this menu, it's automatically snapping to these grid values. So we could do something like the root note, and then go up 3, then go up 5, and then we'll go up 7 semitones. Now let's go over to our speed control, and rather than just individually adjusting this on this non-synced value, let's go ahead and click on this menu, and you'll want to click on this where it says Hertz right here, not where the number value is. So click on this menu, and then we have these different options to sync it to our project's BPM. Let's just do an 8th note. We could do any of these notes. You can do 16th notes, you can do triplets, but for now, let's just put it on an 8th note. Then whenever I press my key, you're going to hear the pitch of our sound changing. So this gives us an arpeggiator. So I could even increase that speed as well. I could do something like 16th notes. And I could change the filtering, increase the amount of reverb. So you can hear that you can get some really cool synth sounds by using this step modulator as an arpeggiator on your sounds. And it'll keep these same interval values as well, so no matter what key you press, it's always going to move the next note up by 3 semitones, by 5 semitones, and then by 7 semitones. You also have the option too, if you wanted to pitch something down in pitch, you could do 12 semitones at this last note, so it would sound like this. So this is a really great way to get some more complicated patterns out of your projects, but in a way that's really simple as well. And just to make a note of it too, you also have the option to modulate your modulators. So if I wanted to control my step modulator by modulating the pitch bend, for example, or the velocity, I could do so. So I could have the speed controlled by my velocity. And then as I press my key really softly, so you can hear there whenever I press my key really softly, it's playing back at the original BPM. And then whenever I press it really hard, you're going to hear it play back at a super fast rate. So it sounds pretty crazy in this example because if you actually look at the note values, it's going up really, really fast. But this is just an example of how you can use the velocity as an external modifier. So that's all for this video on the step modulator section. Join me in the next video where we'll cover the script editor. In this video, we're going to be covering basic scripting and the scripting window of Kontakt. The goal is to give you an introduction to scripting so that you have what you need to get started. The scripts in Kontakt are just a collection of simple lines of code that enable you to access a wide variety of advanced features within the software. With these scripts, you can give your patches advanced controls that are not native to Kontakt Sampler, and you can also program custom user interfaces like what you see here with this flute instrument. So if you look at the interface of this instrument in Kontakt, you can see that it has advanced features. It has this solo button, it's got these different buttons along the top, attack and release, these articulation modes, some master reverb for the entire device, and then underneath this other tab on the bottom, this options tab, you can control the various different velocity, tuning, transpose, key range, pitch bend, and even randomize features. And if we look up at this basic drum set, the one that I've been using in some of the previous videos, you'll see that we don't even have anything along the bottom here. We don't have any advanced features. That's because these haven't been scripted into the patch. We just have a default Kontakt patch that just has the default options that we've edited with the editing menu. So to show how this works, we can go ahead and edit the device. And whenever I open this and have the script editor enabled, you'll see that we have all these advanced options along the top, where all these knobs are. If we switch over to the second tab, you'll see that we have these options here. And then whenever I hit this edit button, if we scroll down through this menu, you'll see that we have all these different lines of code that are defining what these various different sections do. And you can also see that everything is broken down into the two tabs that we have, the instrument tab and the options tab, which you can also see on here as well. So we have the options tab and the instrument tab. And on this specific device, you actually have an effects device running in the background, which is a unison portamento effect, but don't worry about that one for now. So that's a basic overview of what the script editor looks like and how it operates. Now we can go ahead and close this out for now. We can even delete that. Now let's add some basic scripts to the drum set that we've already created. So we can go ahead and open that up. Then we can open up the script editor. And then what we'll be doing in this video is working off of some of the presets that come preloaded with Kontakt. These presets are just lines of code that can give you some more advanced controls over your patches. So we can select those from this drop-down menu. And you'll see that we have all these different factory presets. We have some effects, like a delay sequencer. We have some harmonize effects, like some chords, repitch, and harmonize effects. We have some more instrument-specific effects, performance effects, randomize, and a whole variety of things. So to demo this, let's go ahead and load up one of these effects, the Unison X mode. So we can just click on that. You'll see that now we have these three buttons that have appeared in this top menu. And we also have all of these different script lines that have appeared down in the script editor. So what we can do is increase the amount of voices here. We can increase the amount of spread and the amount of detune, so this effect is a little bit more apparent. So it sounds like this now. If I was to bring down the spread, you hear that it affects the stereo width of the sound. And I can bring down the voices to 1, and we have our original sound. So just by loading up this preset that we have inside of Kontakt, we've created a whole new effects device that isn't available in the insert effects sections. And this is one of the cool things about the script editor, is it gives you lots of advanced features that you can access from the back end of Kontakt that you wouldn't be able to do if you're just loading them into the standard effects sections. So let's say, for example, I liked this effect, but I wanted to have these three knobs, the voices, detune, and spread knobs on this front panel interface, which you'll see right now we don't have anything on this front menu. I can go ahead and open that up, and then we can add in a specific line of code that's going to send these three knobs to that front page. And to do this, it's super easy. All we need to do is add one line of scripting. And we're going to go just below where this says on init, which is on initialize. We're going to press the enter key several times. You can even hit tab just so it keeps everything organized. And then the script that we're going to enter in is make underscore perf view. So PERF-VIEW. So that is make the performance view, which could be selected from this menu. And then once we have that entered in, we hit the apply button. And you'll see down here that the status, it says the script has been updated. And if you misspell something or have an error in one of the scripts that you're working with, this will appear red. And sometimes it'll tell you what's going wrong. So you can go through and fix it. But for now, whenever we go back to our main instrument device, you'll see that now we have these three knobs that have been added to that front interface. So now whenever I increase the detune or adjust the voices, we've given ourselves some advanced effects controls that are now mapped onto the performance view of Kontakt. We also have the option with these different windows as well to add in more of these scripting presets. So if I go over to another one of these tabs, click on that, we can load in something like the delay sequencer, which is a really cool advanced delay sequencing device. It basically acts as a MIDI effect. So instead of using an audio delay, it creates a MIDI delay. We can go down to the edit mode and scroll back all the way up to the top, go just below on init, press the tab key, and then enter in that same script, make perf view. Then we'll press apply. And now that our script has been updated, we can go back to our main menu. And you'll see that we have the unison on the first tab. And then whenever I select this, you'll see that now we have this delay sequencer. And we can go in and adjust this. So just by working off the basic scripting presets, we can add some interesting and advanced functionality to our own Kontakt patches. It's also worth noting that there's tons of really great free scripts online as well. So it's just worth Googling Kontakt scripts to see what you can find that you could then take and add into your patch. So another thing that you'll want to be aware of as well whenever you're working with scripts inside of Kontakt is if I go ahead and close out this device, so we can just hit no for now so it doesn't save our changes, and I load up a pre-existing Kontakt library. So for example, the Native Instruments Scarby Mark I, which is a Rhodes piano plugin that's included with Kontakt. And then whenever I go and open this up, and I go over to the script editor, you'll see that we have a script up here, but whenever I press the edit button, you'll see that it now has this password lock on it. You can also see that reflected by this lock icon that we have along the bottom as well. And all this is whenever a developer creates some sort of more advanced features or functionality that they've custom scripted into their Kontakt patch, is they want to lock that so that nobody else takes that script that they've created. So in order to open the scripting section of this specific plugin, you would have to have that code from the developer. So just so if you ever encounter this with one of the Kontakt plugins that you're working with, that you want to mess around with the scripting, that's what's going on here, and that just means you're not going to be able to edit that specific script. If you'd like to know a little bit more about the scripting language inside of Kontakt, and the specific scripting commands that are available in this programming language, I suggest Googling KSP Reference Manual, which is just the manual that they've created for Kontakt scripting references. So you can see all the various different lines of code, just like the one that we used previously, that you can use to create patches or to add additional features and functionality. So this is a short video on Kontakt scripting. I just wanted to make sure to include this with our discussion on Kontakt because it's an important feature to be aware of, even if you're not specifically a programmer, and even if you're not going to go dive deep into the actual scripting language of Kontakt. So that's all for this video. Join me in the next video where we'll be continuing our discussion on Kontakt 6. In this video, we're going to be talking about how to configure Kontakt as an external instrument rack through using multi-channel audio and MIDI routing. So this is great because you can either improve your CPU performance by just using one instance of Kontakt and then loading each of your instruments into that single instance of Kontakt, or you can use this for things like setting up a drum set and sending the kick to an individual audio channel and then setting the snare to an individual audio channel. This will make the mixing process a little bit easier. So for this video, we're going to be using the Digital Audio Workstation Ableton Live, but the process works the same for any digital audio workstation that you have. You just need the ability to have individual MIDI channels and individual audio channels, which every major digital audio workstation has. So let's go ahead and open up Kontakt, and I'll show you how to configure this. So the first thing that we'll be doing is routing two different instruments to two different audio outputs and MIDI channels. So what I have here is an instance of Kontakt, and I have a cello loaded up and an Irish flute. So now whenever I press a key, the default playback is just going to play this first cello instance. And you can also see that the audio is being routed from our main output. So let's go ahead and configure this so that this Irish flute sound is being triggered by another MIDI channel, and the audio is also being routed to that external MIDI channel. So the first thing that we'll do is go down to this output section, and if you don't see this, go up to this top menu and make sure that outputs is selected. So if it looks like this, then that means you need to go up and select it. And then we're going to go press this plus button, and then we're going to add one stereo channel. So that's what this 2 stands for. Then under this host output dropdown, select the auxiliary channel number 1. And that'll just be this first one. And you want to make sure to select this auxiliary channel or it won't properly route your audio to Ableton Live. So then press OK. And you'll see that we now have a new stereo channel that we can send audio to. So now back up in the Irish flute sound. If you don't see this menu, just press this I and it'll show you this menu. Under the outputs, select stereo output number 2. And then make sure that the audio MIDI channel is set to number 2. It should be correct by default, but if it isn't for some reason, just go down to A and make sure that 2 is selected. And then for now, we can close out Kontakt. And then inside Ableton, we can create a new MIDI track. And then the easiest way to do this inside of Ableton is to use an external instrument device. So that way we can send MIDI from our MIDI channel, and then we can get audio back into this channel, so it keeps everything tidy. But I'll show you here in a minute as well how to also route this to another audio output channel, but for now we use the external instrument device. So go over to Instruments, make sure that nothing is up in this top field here, and load up the external instrument device. So then under the MIDI 2, we want to set this output to Kontakt so that this device is sending MIDI data to the Kontakt instrument. And then from this dropdown, we're going to select number 2. That means it's setting MIDI data to the second channel of Kontakt, which if you remember, going back over to Kontakt, we have this set to MIDI channel number 2. Then the final thing that you want to do is from this drop-down menu, make sure that auxiliary 1 is selected. And that way you get the stereo audio input into this instrument channel. So now, whenever I have this selected and the monitor enabled, the flute sound is being triggered by this MIDI channel and the audio is being routed into it. And then whenever I play this channel, the strings are being triggered from this main channel. So now let's say, for example, you're using a different digital audio workstation or you wanted this audio to be routed onto its own audio channel. You can go ahead and re-enable this monitor here. And then what we can do is create a new audio channel. We can set the external input to Kontakt. Then from this drop-down menu, you'll just set that to auxiliary input number 1. So now whenever I turn this monitor on, and I can turn the monitor off on this other channel, the audio is being routed from Kontakt into this external audio track. Let's take this a step further and take a drum set from Kontakt and route the audio of the kick and snare onto different channels. So let's go ahead and delete this instrument device. We'll leave this audio channel where it is. Then we can open up our instance of Kontakt, delete both of these instruments that we have loaded up, and then I'll go over to my desktop menu and load in this basic drum set that I created in a previous video. So now what we want to do is route the audio from our kick to the main output channel, which it is by default. And then we're going to turn off Edit All Groups. And then we're going to move over to our snare sound and then go all the way down to the source panel. And then underneath this output, which is just the group output, you want to set that to our second output channel. So now it's taking the snare drum sound and sending it out this output channel as opposed to the main master output channel. Then now we can close it out. And whenever I play back my kick drum, whenever the monitor is enabled, and then we can go up and create MIDI clips. So on this first channel, let's go down to C number 1 and create a kick drum. And we'll just do a simple 4 on the floor kick drum pattern here. And then we'll create a snare drum sound here. And then now whenever I close this out and play back this audio clip, you can see that it's routed the kick drum out the main output channel and the snare drum out this separate output channel. If I was to mute the kick drum and then play this back, you could just hear that snare drum. And on the main Kontakt channel, all you hear is that kick drum. So this is great to use if you're working with a drum set and want to send your audio out multiple channels. So that's all for this video on how to route the audio and MIDI settings for using Kontakt as an instrument rack. Join me in the next video where we'll be continuing our discussion on the audio routing inside of Kontakt. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next video. In this video, we're going to be talking about how to use the instrument buses inside of Kontakt. The buses are used for applying effects to multiple groups at one time, and also for mixing your different sampler patches. So for example, I have this drum set loaded up that we've worked with in a previous video. I just have a simple kick, snare, and hi-hat pattern. And let's say that you wanted to have the snare and hi-hat routed to the same reverb unit, but not have any reverb on the kick drum. So what we can do is use the buses to route this up. So first, let's go ahead and route the snare group over to the bus. So make sure that Edit All Groups is deselected. Select the snare, and then go down to this output dropdown on the source panel. And then from here, select bus number 1 to route to the bus. Then we're going to select the hi-hats and do the same. So route this to bus number 1. So now down in the Instrument Bus tab, which may be closed by default, so if you see it like this, just click this little drop down and it'll open up this entire menu. Make sure that bus 1 is selected, and then underneath the effects, just like with the insert effects, you can click on this plus button, select the reverb unit, and let's do the new reverbs that were added in the Kontakt 6 update. And now whenever I press my snare drum and my hi-hat, those two sounds are routed to the reverb unit, but whenever I press my kick drum, no reverb is applied. So this is different than the sends that we had in one of the previous videos, because instead of sending signal from our different sounds to the reverb unit, we're actually applying this reverb as an insert effect on both of these two group channels, the snare and the hi-hat group. Additionally, we also have the option to edit all the buses at once. So if we select this button, and then I go over and make a change, let's say I wanted to add a filter or an EQ to everything, so let's just do a low-pass filter. So now we've applied this low-pass filter, and even though we just have the first group selected, whenever I click over to the next groups, so all of the different 16 different groups that we have, that same low-pass filter is applied to every single group channel. If I was to remove that, you'll see that it's removed that filter from all the different groups. This can be helpful for making global changes to all of your different instrument buses. So we have two ways of selecting all the different buses. As I just showed you in that last example, you can click on the different buses, or you can use this drop-down menu and select the buses from here. You also have the option to name the buses as well, which can kind of help keep things organized. So we can name this reverb, and then whenever I press enter, it changes the output name to reverb. So now instead of bus 1, it's marked as reverb. So now whenever you're sending something to that bus channel, you know what it is. You also have the option to solo the bus as well. So if you're working on a more complicated patch that has lots of different channels and lots of different sampler instances, you can just solo out the bus that you're currently working with. So even when I press my kick, no sound is going to come through, but whenever I press my snare drum or my hi-hat, we can hear sound because we've soloed the hi-hat and snare bus. Additionally, we also have some familiar controls in the bus panel. We have a preset menu, just like with the other effects sections we had in the previous videos. We have an amplifier section with volume and pan controls, and then we also have some different output options. So from this drop-down by default, it's outputting our bus channels to the insert effects, so the signal flow goes from the group channels to the bus, and then out of the bus into the insert effects. So any effects that I apply down here, it's going to apply to the sounds in the buses as well. So if I applied something like a distortion effect, you can hear that this will be applied to our reverbed drum signal. Alternatively, we also have the option to route this around the insert effects. So if I have it set like this, and I go ahead and reset that cabinet that we had in the previous example, the snare and hi-hat will be routed around that distortion unit, but the kick drum will be routed into that cabinet. The final option that we have is to select the various different audio outputs that we have in our Kontakt instance. So I could set this to the main output, or if I was to add another additional output, so get on outputs, press this add button, we could send this to one of the aux channels, then we could press OK. And then now whenever I scroll down, I can select from this menu the additional audio output, and I can send that to a different channel inside of Ableton Live. So this can help whenever you're mixing down more complicated sounds, if you want to send different portions of your drum set out to different audio channels. So that's all for this video on instrument buses. Join me in the next video where we'll be talking about automation and MIDI mapping. In this video, we're going to be covering automation and MIDI mapping inside of Kontakt. So first, let's talk about how to map parameters to our controller device, which in my case is an Akai LPDH drum pad, which has some nice knobs that we'll be mapping to the various parameters of Kontakt. So I have the drum set from the previous video loaded up inside Kontakt. So with the snare group selected, go ahead and right-click on the tune knob and select Learn MIDI CC Automation. Then Kontakt makes it really simple to map this to the different parameters on your controller. So now that we have Learn enabled, let's go ahead and just turn one of the knobs on my controller. And now you'll see that it's MIDI mapped it to the tune knob. You can also map anything to different sliders or any sort of control parameters that you have on your MIDI devices. To get a bit more additional information, you can go over to the Automation tab inside the browser inside Kontakt. Just make sure that your browser is properly open. And then underneath the MIDI automation, which you can select via this tab, you'll see that the CC value for the tune knob is set to our drum set. So now if I rotate that knob on my MIDI controller, you'll see that we have this red light that illuminates. And if I rotate another knob, which in this case is CC10, you'll see that that red light illuminates, and so on and so forth. This helps you tell which parameter is which CC value for mapping for Kontakt. So now whenever I press my snare drum sound and rotate the pitch control, the pitch of our snare sound will change. So it's also worth noting in this menu as well, but if you're working with a patch that's already from Kontakt's factory library or another sample library, you may have a bunch of additional control automations already entered into this panel. So here I just loaded up my own patch because it makes it a bit easier to show off these features. But if you want to remove any pre-existing entries from this menu, so say if you had a bunch of default entries you didn't want to use, for example, you could click on that entry and then just press the remove button to remove that entry from the assignments tab. So for now, let's go ahead and remap our knob to the tune control. So press learn CC automation and rotate the knob. And then let's talk a little bit more about these features that we have along the bottom. So we have a little bit more options about where parameters assigned to. So it says that the parameter is assigned to tune, the instrument device is the basic snare drum, and the group is the snare group. So this just tells us where everything is mapped to. And then we have this from and to control. This lets us set the range for our automation. So we could set this from 50%, so halfway, which in our case would be at an amount of 0. So this right now isn't set to a 0 value, but we'll change that back here in a moment. So now whenever I turn my knob down all the way, it sets it back to 0. And then whenever I turn it up, it's going to turn the pitch up all the way. And then whenever I turn all the way back down, it's going to set it to 0. You could also invert this as well. So you could start at 50% and then go down to an amount of 0. And this will pitch down our sound whenever I rotate the knob on my controller device. Or you could do something in between as well. So you could go from an amount of 20% to 40%. And that would lock this knob so it only operates in that small range. So for now, let's go ahead and set this back to its default. And then we have a few additional options to the right-hand side. The first of which is this soft takeover control, which whenever this is enabled, it'll just avoid sudden parameter jumps that happen whenever Kontakt starts receiving different MIDI automations. So if this is enabled and you're recording a control change on everything, it'll kind of help things sound a bit more cleaner and a little bit more smooth. So if recording a playback of something live, you may want to enable this just so everything sounds a bit smoother. Then you also have this remove option as well that we talked about a bit earlier. So you could just select the parameter and then hit remove, and it will remove that parameter. You could also map multiple parameters to the same knob as well. We can map the tune parameter to our control device, and then we can map that to something like volume. So I'm just moving the same parameter again after I hit learn. And then now you can see that both of those parameters are linked together. So we can have this knob mapped to two different parameters. And you can also see that reflected in this menu as well. So it says it's mapped to the tune control and then other parameters as well, which you can see from this menu at the bottom. So let's go ahead and delete both of those for now. And now we'll talk about how to create automation inside of our digital audio workstation. So what we can do is switch over to the host automation, because now we're not dealing with our MIDI device, we'll be dealing with the automation inside of Ableton. Let's go ahead and select the first parameter. We can click on this and drag it to what we want to automate, which in this case is the tune knob again. So we'll just click and drag that. So now this first host parameter is MIDI mapped to control the tune knob. And you have the same features at the bottom as well from the previous section. So the from and to controls, the assigned to window that tells you what everything is assigned to, soft takeover, and then also remove. And then if I was to close this out and then go into my automation inside of Ableton Live, and if you don't see this by default, go ahead and click on this automation button, and you'll see the automation from this dropdown that's set to the tune control. And I just have a short MIDI clip loaded up that's a snare being played back multiple times. And every single digital audio workstation has a different variation on this. And depending on what digital audio workstation you're using, this drop-down menu may be in a slightly different location, but usually it's on the individual sequencer lane, and then there's some sort of drop-down menu that'll enable you to select these different controls. So then if I want to create an automation lane, I can just click and make two different points. So let's pitch down our sound. So we'll start at 100% and then pitch down to 0. And now you can hear that the tune on the group control inside of Kontakt is MIDI mapped to the automation inside of our sequencer inside of Ableton. And this works for any parameter that you have set inside of Kontakt. So if I was to open this back up and MIDI map something like an effect, so let's go down to the insert effects, select a reverb, and then let's drag this parameter number 1 over to the dry wet control. Actually, let's just do the wet control. So turn that all the way down. We now have that mapped. We can close that out, select it from this drop-down menu, set the 2 automation points, and let's turn that to something slightly under halfway, and that sounds like this. So it's increasing the amount of reverb as our MIDI clip plays back. So that's all for this video on automation and MIDI mapping. Join me in the next video where we'll be talking a little bit more about how to use the various features inside of Kontakt. Thanks, and I'll see you there. In this video, we're going to be covering how to use the Analog Dreams instrument that was added in the Kontakt 6 update. This Kontakt instrument is included with every version of Kontakt 6 and is designed to model classic analog synthesizer sounds. These new instruments, which can be found from the Libraries panel, the Analog Dreams, Ethereal Earth, and Hybrid Keys instruments, are all part of the Play series that was added in the Kontakt update. All these patches were designed off the Wavetable sampler engine that we covered in a previous video. This allows you to blend between different waveforms and affect them to create a variety of custom synthesizer patches. So these act as a hybrid between traditional synthesizers and sampler devices. So I went ahead and loaded in the first of these instruments, the Analog Dreams instrument. And this can just be added by clicking on this from the drop-down panel here in the Libraries panel, and then just dragging and dropping it in. And right now we can just replace that, so we can hit yes. And it'll replace it with the new instance of the instrument. And the default patch just sounds like this. So the top menu is the same for every Kontakt instrument, but the only thing that I wanted to cover from this top menu would be the Presets Manager window. And that could just be selected by clicking on this drop-down, and then you'll see that you have a variety of bass sounds, effects sounds, leads, pads, and even plucks. So I could just load up a few of these to show you what these sound like. So we can start off with this first patch, and this is just a nice bass patch. We have things like effects. We have different lead sounds. We have some pad sounds. And we also have some nice pluck sounds. So we have a few controls on the main interface that allow us to edit our various patches that we've loaded in. We have two different oscillators. These are both wavetable oscillators. We have oscillator A and oscillator B, and then some various different controls along the bottom as well. So let's first start by talking about the oscillator controls. So if I wanted to switch out one of these oscillators, I can click on this A or click on the B, and I can select the various different waveforms from this menu. So right now we have oscillator A selected here, and you could see that whenever I click on one of these wavetables, you now see that there's an A next to it, which means that this is now loaded into our oscillator A slot. If I click on another one of these oscillators, you'll see that this loaded the new oscillator onto the slot A. If I select slot B, and then select one of these oscillators, you'll see that now it's loaded this oscillator onto slot B. You can also scroll around these different pages by either clicking on these arrows, or you can jump to a specific page by clicking on this square icon. Along the bottom, you also have some global controls as well, the first of which is the blend AB, which will blend between the two different oscillators. So if I have this all the way to the left, you only hear oscillator A. I could scroll back to this first page here. So this is this woozy bass oscillator. And if I push this all the way to the right, you only hear oscillator B, which is this gray transistor oscillator, which is this kind of lo-fi pluck sound. If I adjust this knob, I can create blends between the two different oscillators. The other global control that we have is the volume knob. This will adjust the overall volume of the entire patch. So if I wanted to turn down my bass patch, I could turn down this knob, and if I wanted to increase its volume, I could push that up as well. We also have several different controls along the bottom as well. Right now, for this specific patch, we have decay, bitrate, noise, pitch controls, a flanger, and a reverb effect. But depending on which preset you load into this device, these effects along the bottom will change. So let's go ahead and load in one of the lead sounds. And you'll see that some of these effects devices has changed. So now instead of having a flanger, we have a delay unit. And we also have some filter cutoff controls as well. So depending on which patch you load in, you'll get various different options along the bottom menu here. But the two options that will remain consistent for each patch are this blend AB, which blends between the two oscillators and the volume control. Once you have a patch selected, if you'd like to edit one of the oscillators inside of the patch, so let's say, for example, let's listen to oscillator A, and we have oscillator B. So let's say we wanted to switch that out to something different. We could select B. We could select a new oscillator. Let's try Tokyo Sunset. And you'll see that takes a second to load here as well. So then we can create a new blend of our two oscillators. So this gives us a totally different synthesizer sound and was actually really easy to create. This is one of the reasons I really like this device, is because it's super easy to create sounds while you're composing your tracks. So you don't have to worry about spending the time to individually going and edit each parameter inside the synthesizer. You can just get something that sounds good so you can focus on writing and composing your songs. So it's also worth noting as well, because these are Kontakt devices, you also have the option to go in and edit the individual elements inside this patch. So if I click on this icon along the top here, you'll see that it gives us the option to go in and edit the individual elements inside of our patch. So if I was to scroll down here, you'll see that we have all of these different groups that are oscillator groups loaded into our sampler device. And then we also have the option to go in and add effects. So we could go over to the insert effects section and scroll all the way down, and we could add a global filter. So click on that and add something like a low pass filter. And now I have this new filter added across the entire device. So because these are Kontakt devices, you can go in and add any sort of effects or modulation, or even go and change one of the oscillators in the waveform section. So because of this, you'll be able to get lots of different customization options, which is one of the cool things about Kontakt, because even though these instruments are a bit more simple and easy to use, you can open them up and get a lot more complicated and get exactly the sound that you're going for if you know how to use the inner workings of Kontakt. So that's all for this video on the Analog Dreams device from the Kontakt Play series. Join me in the next video where we'll be talking about the next device, Ethereal Earth. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next video. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the instrument Ethereal Earth that was added in the Kontakt 6 update. This is one of the other devices from the Play series, and this device focuses on letting you create textured ambient sounds. So it's mostly used for things like pads, but you can also create different bass and lead sounds out of it as well. It shares a lot of features with the previous device, Analog Dreams, so if you haven't checked out that video yet, I recommend you do so to get a bit more details on how this device functions. But the biggest difference between this and the other devices is that while the interface is basically the same, the sampler's content is totally different. And you're also going to have various different effects controls along the bottom as well. That'll be different from the device controls you have on the other instruments. So to show off this device, let's go ahead and go through a few of the different presets so you can get an idea of what this sounds like. Let's just pick one of the bass sounds here. So this is kind of ambient textured bass sound. You also have some brass as well. We have things like synthesizer leads. So it's a really nice melodic ambient bell texture. We have some nice pads. And this is really where this device has the best sounds, is these really cool ambient pad sounds. So you can really quickly add a lot of really cool textures to your songs just by inserting one of these pad presets. You have some cool strings as well. You also have some cool textures. Which is this interesting rising tonal sound. And we also have some wind instruments as well. So you have a really nice variety of really cool ambient sounds that you can use to add a lot of interesting textures and character to your tracks. So what I wanted to do in this video, since we've already covered the details of the Play Series devices in the previous video, is show you step by step how I would go about customizing a patch from this instrument. This would be the same process that I would use whenever I would be working on a song and using this Kontakt device in that project. That way you can get a good idea of what's possible with this device and how you may want to use it in your songs. So let's go ahead and work off this current patch that we have loaded, this Copper Breeze patch that was from the Wind section of the presets menu. And let's go ahead and edit it. So the first sound I want to change is the wind sound that's in our preset. So let's go ahead and see which oscillator that is. So let's go ahead and listen just to oscillator A. And let's listen to oscillator B. So I like the tonal characteristic of oscillator B, but let's go ahead and switch out oscillator A to something that's a bit more interesting. So we can just click on A, and then we can scroll around these different presets. Let's try this one. So I like this preset, so let's go ahead and use that. Let's create a blend between oscillator B and oscillator A. Maybe more in favor of oscillator A. Let's turn down the release a little bit so our sound doesn't last quite as long once I release a key. Maybe bring down the attack so it's a bit more of a pluck sound. Maybe just increase that slightly to kind of cut off the pop that's at the beginning of it. Then we could even try bringing down the cutoff to see what that sounds like. And then we also have these different controls here. We have the soften control, which is specific to this patch. So let's see what this does. So this looks like this was something that was a control that was tied to oscillator A that we switched out. So right now it's not really doing anything. This next knob is controlling the overall fatness of the sound, and it sounds like it may be adding in some additional overtones as well whenever I increase this amount. So let's keep that about where it is right now, about 62 or so. And now let's increase the amount of space that we have, which is going to be a reverb effect. So now our completed patch sounds like this. So even though this was really quick, we've already created a really nice custom patch based on this player device that we could use in an actual track. So that's one of the really great things about the Kontakt Play series is you can really easily create various different patches really quickly so you can use them in your songs and really just focus on the composition rather than spending a ton of time on sound design on the initial front end of things. So that gives you an idea of how I might use this device to make a custom patch, as well as some of the sounds you can create with it. And again, you also have the option to open up this settings menu and go in and customize any of these effects devices or add in insert effects like filters like we did in the previous video. So because it's a Kontakt device, you have a lot of additional customization that you can do on the back end of things if you'd like. So that's all for this video. Join me in the next video where we'll be taking a look at the hybrid keys instrument. Thanks, and I'll see you there. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the hybrid keys instrument that was added in the Kontakt 6 update. This device focuses on letting you create hybrid keyboard and electric piano style sounds. So this can be a really great way to add different keyboard and piano sounds to your tracks, but to do so in a way that's kind of interesting, has lots of texture, that could be a bit different from using a traditional keyboard sampler device. So because this is also part of the Play series as well, it also has a lot of the same features from the previous devices. So to show off what this device is capable of, let's go ahead and go through some of the different presets that we have. The first of which is a selection of acoustic pianos. We could choose something like 90s Anthem, for example. And this sound could be great if you're creating a house track or something where you want kind of a classic sounding analog piano. You have things like electric pianos. We could do this Aphex Works piano. Which is a nice combination of a Rhodes piano and a synthesized pad sound on top of it. You can also see that reflected down in the wavetables. You have this Padscape wavetable and this soft organic wavetable. which is the main section of that Rhodes piano sound. You also have harpsichord sounds. So let's do the harp runner, for example. You also have various different mallet sounds. You have some hybrid organ sounds. And you also have some synthetic sounding pianos as well. So this one takes on almost a synthetic quality, but we could even choose one of the other ones, which sounds like a keyboard synthesizer style sound. So you can see from those examples that you have quite a bit of variety with the sounds you can get out of this instrument device, which could be really great whenever you're working on your songs. So now that I've showed you off the basic presets of this device, let's go ahead and cover how I would customize a patch whenever I was using the hybrid keys instrument. So let's pick a random sound here. Let's go down and maybe choose something like the mallets. And let's do Hot Tropics, for example. So that sounds like this. So it's a nice mallet sound, but let's go ahead and extend that out and add a little bit more sustain to our sound. So let's go down to the sustain control that we have along the bottom. And keep in mind that these change based on which preset you load. So you may have some different effect settings. Sometimes they have filters, and sometimes they have attack or release or decay settings. So it just depends on which instrument device you're using. Now let's go ahead and check out the oscillators that we have so far. So let's bring this all the way over to oscillator A. So that's kind of this pluck sound that we have that almost has a bell tonality to it. Let's go over and check out the other oscillator, which is this marimba sound. Let's go ahead and change out this first oscillator, oscillator A. So let's click on oscillator A, and then we have all of these different oscillators we can choose from. And the first two pages that we have are mostly keyboard sounds and pluck sounds. And then these other pages are mostly digital waveforms, and even some waveforms you may be familiar with, like Modern Talking from Massive. So let's go ahead and choose one of these other waveforms, maybe Lo-Fi House Piano. Or maybe we could do something like Taped E-Piano. Or even an ambient piano. So let's try out this sound. Let's go back to our main instrument device that we have by clicking on this X, and then let's blend that with this concert marimbas sound. Maybe bring down that cutoff slightly to cut out some of those high frequencies. Which for this patch will probably be some sort of distortion effect. We could bring up our tape delay. Crank up that reverb to get a bit more ambience. And then now our completed patch sounds like this. So that just gives you an idea of how I can use this device to create a custom sound that I could use in one of my projects. And you could always open up the settings of the device and add different insert effects, sends, or change out any of the way that the wavetables are operating. But this just gives you a good idea of how I may use this to create a customized keyboard patch. So that's all for this video on the Hybrid Keys Play Series device. Join me in the next video. We'll be wrapping up our discussion on KONTAKT 6 through showing off how to design a more advanced sampler patch from scratch. Thanks, and I'll see you there. In this video, we're going to be wrapping up our discussion on KONTAKT 6 by showing how I would create a multi-sampled piano patch. While there are many different types of sounds you can get out of KONTAKT patches, I figured it would be helpful to show a more practical example so you can get a good idea of how I would go about creating a patch in a real-world example. So in this video, we'll be taking a collection of individual note samples from an acoustic piano and mapping them across the keyboard and adding effects so that we have a nice playable multi-sampled piano patch. So first, let's begin by creating a new instrument. So load up KONTAKT and then go over to this save icon. Then from this drop-down menu, press New Instrument. This will give us a new blank instrument to work with. And then we want to go over to this wrench icon, click on this to get the drop-down menu, and then go over to the mapping editor. And this will give us the mapping editor where we can load in all of our individual samples. So now let's go ahead and navigate to where the samples are located on my hard drive, which I've just went ahead and placed on my desktop in a folder. So go over to Files, and it will be in this Piano Samples folder. These samples are just a bunch of individual one-shots that sound like this. And there are a variety of different pitches. So let's go ahead and select the first one all the way at the top, then scroll down to the bottom, press the Shift key on your keyboard, and that's for both Mac and PC. Then press the last sample, and then we want to drag and drop these into Kontakt. And make sure to drag and drop them down at the bottom around here, instead of all the way at the top, or else everything won't map properly. So now we have these samples loaded up, but none of these pitches will be correct. So for example, this first sample is going to be an A in the second octave, but we're in the octave of 0, and it's also going to be playing back at the wrong note. But we want to change that, so we'll be using the auto map features that Kontakt has. So with the single sample selected, go up to this edit menu, press the drop down, go down to the auto map setup, and then underneath these drop downs, make sure that the piano, the first part of the file name, is set to ignore me, so that doesn't do anything with this part of the file name. And then with the second part, make sure that this is set to make root key. Then once you're finished with that, you can go ahead and press apply, and it's going to map that first key. We can hit close for now, and then we can make sure to select all of our samples. We can go up to this auto button. This is the auto map selected. So this will auto map all of those root keys so that everything plays back at the right pitch. And then we want to go ahead and press this next button, the auto spread key ranges via root key button. And this will spread all the individual samples across the keyboard and optimize it so that every sample plays as few notes as possible. So that way we don't have to heavily pitch shift any of our samples. So you'll see that the only one that's mapped to a bunch of keys is the lowest note and also the highest note. But the other samples are only mapped to a small selection of keys, and that's spread across the entire keyboard so that everything doesn't have to pitch shift too much, so that we get a little bit more of a natural sound, while minimizing the amount of pitch shifting artifacts that we have in our piano patch. So now that everything's mapped properly, I can go ahead and play that back. So whenever I press a C note on my keyboard and jump through those octaves, you can hear that the individual samples are being played back at the proper pitches. I can now also play back things like chords, and everything will play back as expected. So the first change that we want to make now that we have everything mapped across Kontakt Sampler Engine is scroll down to the modulation envelope. This is just the amplifier envelope. And we're going to press that release up slightly to just a little under 7,000 milliseconds, or a little over 7,000 milliseconds. So now whenever I press a note and release, it has a little bit more of a fade out rather than just cutting off instantly, which would be this, which doesn't sound very natural, and that's not the type of response you'd have from an acoustic piano, because an acoustic piano you'd have, even after releasing the key, a little bit of resonance happening inside the piano, and also some resonance and reverberations happening inside the room as well. So you'd have this sort of fade out happening rather than the sound just instantly cutting out. So that just kind of helps it sound a little bit more organic and more like an actual piano rather than a sampler patch. The next thing that we want to do is go over to our group editor, and we're just going to rename this. So double click on the group name, and we'll just rename this to something like piano. And that way it kind of just keeps things organized if we end up adding more groups a little bit later. We can close that out for now, and then we can scroll down to our insert effects and start rounding out our patch. And I want to apply the insert effects in this section because if I end up changing any of the groups a bit later, I want all these effects to be applied to every single one of those groups so that all samples are affected the same way so that we get a little bit more of a cohesive piano patch. So the first effect that we're going to add is an equalizer. So click on this drop-down menu, go to the 2-band EQ. And we're going to be using this to kind of cut out some of those low mid frequencies and also boost some of the high frequencies to add a bit of top end clarity. So go over to about 136 Hertz on the low end, and then just go over to the gain and enter it -2. And that's just going to cut out some of these low mid frequencies. So this just helps remove some of the boxiness of that piano sound. And if I was to boost this frequency, you can hear what that sounds like. So this just helps everything sound a bit clearer. And then we want to add some top end frequencies as well. So go over to 6000 Hertz here. So double click on that menu, type in 6000, and then go over to this band 2, put that at 1.7 so that we get a bit wider of a band, and then put this up to 1.5 decibels. And that way we kind of have this nice top end shelf boost going on. And this just adds a little bit of air and clarity to our sound. Which will help it stick out a little bit more in a mix down. The next effects device we want to add is a stereo effect to add a bit more stereo width to our sound. We go over to the next effects slot, click on the drop down menu, go all the way down to utilities, go down to stereo modeler, click on that, put the spread at an amount of 50, so it gives us 100% spread, and then select the pseudo stereo button, and then now we have this nice wide sound. Because those original piano samples we have are quite mono, they don't really have any stereo width, this effect will add some stereo width back into the signal and helping our sound a little bit bigger. And depending on how much width you want as well, you could always reduce this to something a bit less, like 25. Just depending on what you want to go for. The next effects device we want to add is a compressor unit, just to add a bit more attack to the start of the piano sound, and then also to kind of compress all those samples together so they sound like they're coming from a single instrument rather than a bunch of individual samples. So click on the drop-down menu, go down to Dynamics, then we're going to be using the solid bus compressor, which models the compressor from an SSL mixing console. So it's a really excellent compressor and also a really great standalone plugin as well. But luckily they've included it with Kontakt, so we don't have to add any external effects or VSTs. We could just do everything inside Kontakt, which is fantastic. So now let's adjust that threshold control. Let's push that up to right around 13 or so. Let's push the attack up as well to about 10 milliseconds. Let's put the makeup gain up to about 13 decibels because we'll be compressing quite a bit, so we want to bring back up that gain so that it stays at a consistent volume. Bring the ratio down to an amount of 3, put the release up slightly, and leave the mix where it's at. And we can bring that output down to about -9. 8.9 will work fine. And then that so far sounds like this. So this adds a bit more attack and presence to our signal and makes it sound a little bit more natural and punchy. So the last thing that we'll do is add a little bit of reverb to our signal with the sends. So go ahead and go down to the send effects, add in one of the reverb units. We'll keep this on the room reverb setting. Those added in the Kontakt 6 update. The only thing that we want to do is take that time down slightly. And then we also want to bring down the send amount so that we don't have too much reverb. So about -24 is fine, just because we don't want to drown our piano sound in reverb. We want it to sound a bit more natural. So now our completed piano patch that we've multi-sampled and tracked out across the keyboard, and also equalized, compressed, and added some reverb, all sounds like this. So that's all for this video, and that wraps up the course as well. While this is a bit more practical example of a patch, it gives you a good idea of what's possible when combining this with the additional techniques that we've learned. It could really open up unlimited sound design options for your songs and for your productions. If you like this course, I encourage you to check out the additional courses on Groove 3's website to continue learning about Kontakt, as well as other plugins and digital audio workstations. Thanks, and I hope to see you in another course soon.